Alrighty, welcome everybody to episode number 14. I think it's 14 of watching every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet. How are we doing, everybody? How is life treating you? Scale of 1 to 10. How are we feeling today? I know it's late. I know, as I mentioned in other podcasts, where I'm getting at, the sun is just dropping like immediately. So I get it. Seasonal depression is a real thing. But how are we doing today? I am doing pretty well, I would say. And I'm excited to discuss today because I've been seeing a lot of apologists in particular, but just in general, people talking about Alex O'Connor and saying that he is becoming a Christian. He's on his way. If he just continues this journey, he will eventually become a Christian through this searching process. And I mean, maybe that is true. Maybe that is not true. Who really knows? My thought, though, is the things that people are pointing to in favor of this, I think speaks to a different idea, a different phenomena. So if you haven't already, I have a poll out. Vote in the poll. Do you think Alex O'Connor is becoming a Christian, or is he a Christian, or anything along those lines? Vote in the poll below, yes or no, or just, comment below and be like, I don't even know who Alex O'Connor is. And if that's you, welcome to this series. I'm watching every single one of his videos. He's probably the biggest philosopher of religion on the internet, biggest, outward public-facing atheist potentially on the internet as well. And so that's kind of who he is. And this series is about watching every single one of his videos in hopes of him coming on to the podcast as a guest. So, yeah, we will see. But what are y'all saying? You guys are chatting away. So easy to vote after I hear today's video. Ah, yes, you have to hear the wisdom before you put in all of your bets. Doing good, scale 7.5. Okay, 7.5 is not too bad. I mean, it's not a 10, but we don't need to be a 10. There was something that someone was mentioning to me the other day. And this is my personality. I try to be like a 10, be like super bubbly as much as I can. I think that's just kind of how I was raised. And they said, you don't have to be a shining light everywhere you go. You can just shine in specific places. Boom! Blew my mind. I was like, wow, that is amazing. So put that on a bumper sticker, dude. So good. But yeah, vote below. Do you think Alex O'Connor is becoming a Christian or not? And I will be recording soon because I'm going to do a video live in front of you guys discussing this, and then I'll be posting the video itself later. So you'll be able to see me kind of doing a video live. So that'll be cool. The benefit of being a part of these podcasts for the live streams. And then on top of that, I've been doing this the last few weeks, but we are doing a bingo card. So as we are doing today's live stream, you can follow along and look at some of the classic Alex O'Connor isms. So some of the things that he brings up a lot of the time, whether it's, the triangle in the brain, that one's definitely coming up today. I can tell you that. So whether it's that, or whether it's, say, like Islam, or whether it's quantum physics, the Gospel of Thomas, things of those sort, you can check those off, and you get a little free check mark in the middle. So you can follow along, and as these isms, these Alex O'Connor isms come up, you can fill that out. And if you get a bingo, I will shout you out. Just let me know in the comments, and I will shout you out there. And then before I get into the recording, I also wanted to recap where are we at in terms of watching every single Alex O'Connor video. Currently on my own, I have watched 143 videos. I watched quite a few this week. And then together we have watched 29 videos. So today we're going to hit the big 3-0. So I'm super excited about that. Let me know in the comments below. Are you excited about that? And are you excited to discuss this whole phenomena of whether Alex O'Connor is becoming a Christian or not? And then make sure to vote. Make sure to vote below. Do you think he is? Do you think he's not? All of that good stuff. Like, subscribe, everything. How am I doing on the scale? I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, I am doing probably 8.5, 9. No, I'll say 8.5. And the main thing is this guy right here, coffee. Oh, it's a godsend. I love coffee. It's so good. So it gets me through my day. And honestly, I just get so, it's weird. I get really excited whenever the coffee's finished. And I hear that little beep. I'm like, ooh, let's go. It's what gets you out of gets you out of bed in the morning sometimes. So, yeah, we're chilling. We are chilling. So, I am going to start the recording and we can get going with the actual content here. So here we go. Is Alex O'Connor becoming a Christian? It's a interesting question, and a lot of people have so many thoughts and opinions on this topic. And today I want to discuss this because as someone who, I don't really care whether Alex becomes a Christian or not a Christian. I'm agnostic. I follow him along, and I'm doing a series actually watching every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet and commenting uniquely on each and every one of them in hopes that he'll come onto my podcast. So, I have been really following him for years, and I've seen a lot of the content, especially the recent content that people are saying is referring to him as becoming a Christian or on the way to becoming a Christian. So today we're going to look at that stuff, observe it, and really think through, what does this mean? Is he actually becoming a Christian? Should we be excited for that, or should we just be patient and see where his journey of exploration really, truly leads? So here's some preamble. The first thing I want to mention is that Alex has done a lot of content lately that would not be considered orthodox in terms of Christianity. What do I mean by this? Well, we can look at his latest video, which is why I'm a heretical Christian. If that's not orthodox, well, I don't know what is. Another episode that he did, in this one it says materialism is false, which at the face of it sounds kind of like he's refuting materialism, but he's refuting, the guest he has on is refuting materialism in favor of a different view that sees the world in terms of everything being of one universal mind. So it's very similar to Hinduism, but definitely not similar to Christianity. Now, why are people saying that Alex is becoming a Christian? Well, it's because of this conversation right here that Alex had with Bear Grylls. And Bear is a person who's very famous. He's famous for Man vs. Wild, the famous TV show where he's getting dropped in the wild and has to try and survive. Well, Bear had a lot to say about Christianity because he has been a Christian. He struggled with doubts over time, and he recently wrote a book, a dramatized version of Christianity and the Gospels specifically, the story of Jesus. So here we see the greatest story ever told. So this is the conversation. This is the context of when Alex made this key statement. And I'll play it here in a second, but the key statement is important because this is exactly what so many people are saying is the reason why he's becoming a Christian. And what is that statement? Well, he said that he thinks that Christianity is more plausible than he originally thought it to be. Here we go.
Like the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, it was really popular, the debates that they were doing, they called it New Atheism.
Yeah.
And it was this body of atheist thought with the God delusion, this kind of stuff, which was really popular. And it had this sort of quite strident, debate me, bro, kind of attitude. And I was really swept up by that. I thought that was really exciting and cool. And I was beginning to sort of shake that off and grow up a bit, essentially. And then running the podcast, what I've realized is this is far more interesting and intricate, and I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before. So,
So there it is. Christianity is far more plausible than he originally thought it to be. Now, that has really been put through the ringer. So many people have been responding to this. And a lot of people have been saying that Alex is becoming a Christian even before he made this statement. But this statement has really lit up the fire. And a lot of famous apologists, a lot of famous Christians have been saying, oh my gosh, Alex is becoming a Christian, blah, blah, blah. And so we'll look at some of these things. First and foremost, I want to shout out, I want to look at what what Michael Knowles has to say on the matter, because Michael Knowles here is basically stating that he thinks Alex is going to become a Christian. Now, this is outside of the context of that video, but this is prior to that video. So even before this video came out, we can see that people were already thinking that he would become a Christian. So let's see that real quick.
This is why Alex O'Connor might become a Christian. Watch this.
You know what's forming is Alex O'Connor's going to become Christian. And I really like Alex O'Connor.
He's very charismatic and very sweet guy.
But that to me is a good sign, because the fact that he's very sharp, he's all these great things, but he doesn't have hardcore answers to all of those questions. He's obviously curious. He probably hangs out with more Christians than he hangs out with atheists. The moment that he really starts to keep following that, he's going to become Christian. There's no new atheism. The new atheism is old and it's dead.
It made so many promises to our society that the more secular we become, we'll have this scientific revolution and everybody will be more rational. And then you fast forward that out 25 years and they've delivered on none of those promises.
Even the book, God is Not Great, which doesn't even make that argument. Point is, Christians have done things that I don't like. Fast forward now, 20 years after New Atheism, Richard Dawkins is calling himself a cultural Christian.
And getting canceled.
For
basic biology.
He saw the conclusion of the New Atheism, which is Islam. In his country, in the UK, right? So, and I kind of hold out hope for Mr. O'Connor. Alex, if you're watching this.
Yes. So even Michael Knowles, famous Michael Knowles, thinks that Alex is going to become a Christian. So there's a lot of things happening here, a lot of people making claims. But I want to key in specifically on one person who responded to this claim that Christianity is plausible and it is inspiring philosophy. Him and his whole team, they did a response to this. And they said some of the following, basically saying that Alex is considering, the resurrection and all of that, which isn't in the context of the video, but we'll see exactly what they have to say here.
Podcast, what I've realized is this is far more interesting and intricate, and I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before. So, I'm still not a Christian.
That's the clip that's been going viral lately, man. He's saying this is a lot more plausible than I initially thought, which is what we tend to get with the resurrection argument. I mean, we've all been there. Like, okay, what's the evidence Jesus really did rise from the dead? Is this just something being taken on faith, and then you start to study the evidence, and you're like, okay, well, women discovered this tomb. That's weird, because no ancient culture would invent that. Then you have Jesus appearing to multiple groups, and you're like, okay, well, they made that up later. Well, no, the creed of 1 Corinthians shows that group appearances were happening quite early, and they were proclaiming the gospel message quite early. So legendary development out the window there, at least in terms of the resurrection. And then you go, okay, well, like group hallucinations, psychologists are like that. Those don't happen. And then you go, well, maybe it's just something weird happened. Well, you go look at their background culture. They thought the Messiah was going to be a conquering king. Why did they have hallucinations that convinced them of a dying and rising Messiah who atoned for the sins of the world? I mean, even in Acts, opening chapter of Acts, they're like, when are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Like, because that was so embedded in their cultural thinking.
Yeah.
They're even like, okay, now, anyway, you're going to do what you're actually going to do. Like the resurrection thing, that's cool. But now let's get to the real Messiah stuff where you defeat Rome and reestablish our kingdom. It's like, so they have these group appearances, and then they have this totally foreign belief to their background knowledge. What do we do with that? Like, how do we explain this naturally? And I love what Tim McGrew says about this. He says, quite frankly, bring it, skeptics. Yes, we do think it's more probable that a resurrection happened than that the disciples lied. We do think it's more probable that a resurrection happened than they hallucinated, or this was a later development. Like, that's what the data shows.
Mm-hmm.
So right there, we see a response to this saying, you know, Alex is realizing, you know, the likeliness of the resurrection, and that the claims of the resurrection are super duper strong. Now, I don't want to get too in depth into the claims that were made there. There were quite a few made there. One was the group hallucination idea. There's a lot of potential reasons as to why we maybe should doubt the idea of a group hallucination. When we look at that creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we see that the vision of Jesus in front of the 500 may be more of this less bodily image, but this person in the sky, kind of a light in the sky, similar to the vision to Paul. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is the idea that that was a later addition to the old creed. So the creed had its own thing, but we know that when Paul was quoting the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, that he added on his own testimony of Jesus appearing to him. That was not a part of the original creed, because the creed predates when Paul became a Christian, and yet Paul quotes his own conversion in the creed. So what we know is that Paul added to the creed. The creed predated him, right? And so with that is the idea that potentially the vision of the 500 is also a later addition, which the language, some argue in favor that the language of that portion of the creed matches more of Paul's linguistic style rather than the linguistic style of the creed itself. So that's a major debate. There's so many scholarly debates that are happening here about the resurrection. Suffice to say, it's not a clean cut. The resurrection definitely happened because of the evidence, or the resurrection definitely didn't happen because it's ridiculous. I think it's just based upon your background, you are going to be in favor of the resurrection or not in favor of it. I've studied it for many years, and that seems to be the case. And that's exactly what Dr. Dale Allison, historian Dale Allison, one of the leading proponents and researchers of the resurrection narratives, also has to say on the matter. So why I got into all of that, but the main thing I wanted to say is that these people are, I think, just overreacting to a single comment that he made at one point. And when we look at the context of Alex and the videos that he makes and the things that he's proposing, right, as likely to be true and ideas that intrigue him, they are very much so like not in line with Christianity at all. And when we think about what that conversation was when he was talking to Bear Grylls, what we see is that this is probably less of his actual opinion and more of this idea of appreciating the story of Jesus as a story, appreciating the literary story of Jesus, and not necessarily caring about the historical end of things. And when you're in that kind of conversation where you're not really trying to push, you're just trying to be friendly, and you're just trying, I have done this in my own conversations. I failed to push where maybe I should have pushed, or I chose not to push in a conversation when I could have pushed on something, mainly because I just wanted the person to talk. I just wanted them to share their life, share their experience, and I didn't want to get into the weeds of everything. So what does Alex actually believe then? Is he truly becoming a Christian or not? Well, as I said, we can just look at his latest videos. Why am I a heretical Christian? He talks about panpsychism here. He is a proponent of the early Christians not actually having been persecuted, as well as discussing the idea that probably only Peter and James died for their faith potentially, and we don't even fully know that. There's a lot of unknowns there. But when it comes to the stories of all the apostles, specifically the 12 and James and Paul, we see that the legends of their death that you'll find in Fox's Book of Martyrs all date to 150 to 200 years after the death of Jesus. That's when they first start popping up, and then they become more mythological and outrageous over time. And so all of that is on his channel, and he is talking about these things. He's expressing these ideas. And to say that he is becoming a Christian, I think is missing the context of what he's being a proponent of. Now, this comes from a recent conversation that he had on the Diary of a CEO podcast, where Alex basically responds to this exact thing, where Christians and just people of all these different faiths are saying, oh, you're going to join our faith. Just keep searching, keep looking, and maybe he will. But this is how he feels. Like, in a moment of just true reflection, this is how he feels about this stuff.
This is indefensible.
Okay.
I get told a lot by a lot of different people that I'm quite clearly on a particular road. Christians very often say that it seems as though I'm on the verge of Christian conversion. And I think that's often just a result of having nice conversations with them where I don't jump down their throat and say, actually, there's some truth in this, or actually there are some good arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, or this kind of stuff. And suddenly I have people saying, he's so close.
Is that because he's
kind of annoying,
clearly a man searching for meaning?
Something.
So I'll play that last part there real quick because Stephen spoke over him, but he says, I find that quite annoying.
Saying, he's so close.
Is that because he's
kind of annoying,
clearly a man searching for meaning?
Something.
So I just realized that I did not play the video. I'm sorry, guys. I will transition real quick. Let me go back to... Where do I need to go to? It was 2:31? No. 3:32. Sorry, y'all. Okay, 3:32. I did not show the video. This is from Alex's experience on Diary of a CEO. And this is a moment when Alex is truly expressing how he feels when he is labeled as going on a certain religious path. So this is his true, in my opinion, this is his real response to when people do this kind of thing, when they say, oh, you're going to become a Christian, oh, you're going to become a Muslim, oh, you're going to become blah, 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 blah. Because he's on a journey and he doesn't want you to define where the journey is going to end. And I think this is a true response as to what that looks like.
Alex.
I don't know. No, not pattern recognition. This is indefensible.
Okay.
I get told a lot by a lot of different people that I'm quite clearly on a particular road. Christians very often say that it seems as though I'm on the verge of Christian conversion. And I think that's often just a result of having nice conversations with them where I don't jump down their throat and say, actually, there's some truth in this, or actually there are some good arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, or this kind of stuff. And suddenly I have people saying, he's so close.
Is that because he's
kind of annoying,
clearly a man searching for meaning?
Okay. I'm going to play that last part again real quick because I think it's very important. Stephen kind of speaks over him there, but he says that I think it's kind of annoying.
People saying, he's so close.
Is that because he's
kind of annoying,
clearly a man searching for meaning?
Something.
So to me, this is Alex actually just speaking about how he truly feels when faced with these kind of things. And so while we can speculate, I understand the excitement, people really want Alex to become a Christian. I understand that. I can empathize with that. And it makes a lot of sense. If you love his content, you think he's a great guy, you think he's a super open-minded person, there's obviously you're going to want to spend eternity with him, right? But when we label someone and we say, this is what they're going to be, this is who they're going to be, they're just ignorant to the truth. Alex has done a lot of research. He's spent his entire career researching this. And for you to come in and say, oh, no, he's going to figure it out someday. Maybe he will. And maybe he will follow your line of thinking, your worldview. But to say that he's inevitably going to become a Christian or inevitably going to become a Muslim or whatever path, I think it belittles the journey that he's currently on, and basically says that it's worthless because don't even bother thinking about it. You're just going to become such and such faith. The other thing he mentioned is that a lot of the time people do it because in conversations, he considers what people have to say, and he recognizes when his opponent, especially in a debate, has a good argument. Not even a debate, I should say more in a conversation. When they have a good argument or a good point, he recognizes it, and actually he will share it with other people. And I think that's a very good thing, because what it does is it teaches people what's out there. It's not enough to just say, oh, I have an argument in favor of what I believe, so I'm going to share that with everyone, and now everyone has to believe what I believe. No. If you can't defend the opposite side, if you can't play devil's advocate, then you don't understand the topic. You just understand half the topic. Probably not even half, because there's always more than just two sides to a story. Alex does that super well. And I think when people see him defending Christianity because he can play devil's advocate, because he's done his research, that's when they think he's on the road to becoming a Christian. Maybe he is. I'm not here to say whether he is or not. But what I am here to say is clearly, I like this clip to me shows that Alex is annoyed of this, and he doesn't really like it when people do that. And I think it's probably worth letting him have his space to explore ideas. Now, what are some of these ideas that Alex has been exploring? Well, one of them is panpsychism. And this is, if anything, very much so against Christian doctrine. In this clip, Alex rejects the idea of a soul. He favors the ideas of Vedic scriptures, which then became Hindu traditions. He favors the ideas of pre-Socratics and even people on psychedelic drugs. In my opinion, Alex is showing what he's truly interested in here and what he is favoring as good ideas that are intriguing, interesting, and worth looking into. And I personally agree with him. I think these are really interesting ideas that all of you should consider looking into. So I'll play this clip and you guys can share your thoughts. This is from the Modern Wisdom podcast. This happened just 3 weeks ago. So very recent.
Tell me on it.
People are beginning to realize that consciousness, it's always been like, you'll have someone and they'll say like, consciousness, it's just such a mystery. And like, it's like trying to view the window pane through the window pane because we experience the whole world through that's interesting, but everybody kind of already knows that. That's why we're at the table having the conversation. There is a stark increase happening in the view that consciousness is, so to speak, fundamental. Here's the interesting thing. Yeah, so panpsychism, right? And here's one interesting observation, which is that there are these cliches that crop up basically everywhere you look, right? If you look at ancient Vedic literature, if you look at a meditative monk who achieves enlightenment in the forest somewhere, if you look at Joe Bloggs, who took LSD last week and had like this insane experience at the peak of his hero dose, they will say similar things, which is this sort of cliche of everything is one, I am one with the universe, the ego death, the dissolution of the
non-duality
self.
type thing.
Exactly. And this kind of stuff has been present in these philosophical traditions, like from the beginning of history. The pre-Socratics talk about it a little bit too. And I think that we're beginning, like, people are beginning to become much more open to the idea that there is something true about that, and there's a reason why that keeps coming about. Panpsychism is growing in popularity because the problem is, like, we believe that there is a world of matter, and we know that we are conscious. And you've got a few options available to you. Either the consciousness is like a totally separate thing from the material, which makes it seem really weird. And why does it interact with me? If consciousness is literally immaterial, if it's not made of matter that like my brain and my body is, then it is a complete mystery how it would interact with my physical body. Like, it's not like it's floating around out there. It has no spatial dimension. It's not material.
It's another piece of matter that is not matter.
So
but
the
it
idea,
must be some other kind of matter.
Like, it is as mysterious that my mind would interact with my brain as it would be if my mind suddenly started interacting with your brain, or with that can of tasty new tonic on the table. Like, it would just be like, what are you talking about? If these are two separate kinds of things, you're talking about like taking the number 2, adding in a chair, and like getting, the color orange. It's just categories of different things that seem like they shouldn't be able to interact. Okay, so then maybe the mind is just made out of material. But then you run into some intuitive problems about the nature of thoughts. People keep coming at me because I like to sort of froth at the mouth over the thought of closing my eyes and imagining a triangle and asking where on earth that triangle is. There are true facts about that triangle. It's got 3 sides, right? That's true. It's really, like, I can see it in my head. It's true that it's got 3 sides. But where is that triangle? It's not just made up of the matter of my brain. If I cut open your brain, I'm not going to find a triangle in there. You can sort of find the material activity that's correlated with the experience of the triangle. That's not the same thing as the triangle.
Are you guys here for the halftime show?
Oh, no.
I'll have to stitch this part out. But yeah, so far, I mean, to me, it's very clear that he's not peddling Christianity, but he seems to be peddling lots of other ideas. He's a proponent of ideas. That's what Alex is, which is great. I love that part about him. For stitching purposes, we'll go back a bit. Okay, here we go.
Find a triangle in there. You can sort of find the material activity that's correlated with the experience of the triangle. That's not the same thing as the triangle. So you've sort of got this sort of barrier problem of where you get from this material stuff to this non-material stuff. And the panpsychist says there is no barrier. But instead of saying everything's made out of material and so is consciousness, they just say that everything is consciousness from the get-go. And therefore, you get consciousness. The biggest myth for the panpsychist and other related schools in consciousness is that complexity is required for consciousness. That might be the big myth that needs to dissipate.
So is their argument
that
because the brain is the most complex thing we know, it's the one that's got the most consciousness?
It's got it. The things that we think consciousness is are actually sometimes just what consciousness does. Okay, let me.
What the fuck does that mean?
I'll explain it this way, right? So if consciousness just means like some kind of experience, some kind of awareness, right? When we talk about what makes somebody conscious, we might talk about things like memory, first-person conscious experience, awareness, these kinds of things. But like rudimentary consciousness on its own wouldn't necessarily require any of those things. Imagine for a moment that you had no memory. I don't mean like you forget what happened yesterday, like you've got dementia. I mean literally no memory laid down in any instant. What would that be like? It's kind of impossible to imagine. Imagine you were falling through the air and no memory was being laid down at any instant. Would you even know that you were falling? You'd have no sort of instant before to compare yourself with. You wouldn't even know that you were a being. You wouldn't know that your feet are part of you. You wouldn't have, there's no time for that to happen. You would literally, like, it's impossible to even conceive of what the content of your thoughts would be. They would be the simplest possible thing that consciousness could experience. And yet it would still be conscious and aware. And so this like the laying down of memory is something that consciousness can do, which gives rise to more complex conscious behaviors, like our conversations and me knowing that, we're in a building and that this is a microphone and that kind of stuff. But that is not consciousness. That's just one thing that consciousness does when it's complexly arranged. So when we look at like a rock and say there's no consciousness, and look at a brain and say there is, and it's because, the brain is complicated. The panpsychist says, no, consciousness is at the foundation of all of it. You've just got more complicated consciousness, which does things like memory and self-awareness and communication, and you've got less complex consciousness, which just sort of, at the atomic level, just sits there and sort of fizzes around, right? The analogy I sometimes give to explain this is imagine comparing.
So you can watch the rest of that on the Modern Wisdom podcast on their channel, but this is an idea that Alex has been proposing for a long time, for several months, throughout this entire year. So the entire time that Christians who are in their own bubble and only see Alex talk about Christianity when he's talking about Christianity, they are missing these conversations where Alex is clearly showing what he actually is interested in, which is this idea of things like emotivism, which is the idea that all morality is just expressions of emotion. He's also really into this idea that he expressed here, panpsychism. He's also extremely into the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostic texts. In fact, that clip that I showed with Dr. K, where he said he found people saying that he's going to become a Christian annoying, in that very clip, Dr. K was saying he's going to follow the Gnostic road and become a person of gnosis and practicing Gnostic. All of this to say, Alex is a complicated person. Maybe he is becoming a Christian. Maybe he's not becoming a Christian. Maybe he's becoming a Hindu. Maybe he's becoming a lot of different things. But I think the key here is we need to stop assuming where the end of his path is going to lead, because you don't know that. You do not know where the end of his road, where the end of his path is going to lead. If you are a Christian, it's okay to be excited and desire for him to become a Christian. But for you to say you will definitely become a Christian is very arrogant, because Alex has spent a lot of time and effort. He spent an entire career studying this tradition and still is an atheist. If you think that you have studied this topic more than him, unless you are a scholar or an apologist who has been doing this just as long as he has, I highly doubt that you know more about the topic than he does. So, let's all have some humility. Let's give Alex some space, and let's just enjoy where he leads. Let's enjoy these topics. Let's explore things together, and let's learn together, because that's what it's really all about. It's not about being right, but it's about getting closer to what is true and finding some really interesting ideas along the way. I'm Jackson of Truth and Tradition. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe, hit that like button, and if you want to donate to the channel, if you like what you see, you can donate at the link below at buymeacoffee.com and leave me a message of any amount. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Alrighty. How was that, guys? How was it? Did I present myself well? I haven't recorded live before, so that was a unique experience. I'm glad that you guys were able to be a part of it. At the end of the day, I agree. I really think Alex should just be left alone on this topic, and we need to give him the space that he needs. Now, with today's video, we are actually discussing his latest video, which I think is on topic with the idea of whether Alex is a Christian or not. It is this video here with Philip Goff, who is a panpsychist as well. He has recently converted to Christianity. He has recently become a Christian, and he is a avid atheist before that. And so I am very excited to dig into this conversation because I think it's an extension of this topic of whether Alex is on his way to become a Christian. If he is on his way to become a Christian, he's on his way to become a Christian, I think, that's similar to Philip Goff, where he doesn't believe that the Bible's inerrant. He rejects the, notion of the soul. Potentially, he thinks that of universalism is true, so then everyone eventually goes to heaven. I don't know exactly, but I know that a lot of these ideas are ingrained in what Philip Goff believes. And if there's any sort of Christianity that Alex is going to be a proponent of, it would be this heretical form of Christianity that I think a lot of, Christian apologists, like just Christians in general, are not going to be happy with. But it's where the journey leads. And if that's where the journey leads, I think we need to respect that, as I said before. So as we dig into this, I haven't actually watched the episode yet. I know it says that I have, but that was just to get the thumbnail, as always. And but I'm very excited to dig into it because Philip Goff is a really smart guy. And the fact that he's a Christian now, I think, should bring to light to a lot of agnostics and atheists, to myself even, on how I can rethink and be thinking about something like Christianity, which I left and, is hard to even, I think about as being true sometimes. Just sometimes. Other times it is. But to hear a voice like this who is having similar mindset, similar kind of thinking in terms of philosophy, in terms of physics, and becoming a Christian, I think is encouraging, because it's like, okay, what could Christianity look like if I don't believe in a soul, or if I don't believe in, say, an afterlife? What does a Christianity like that look like? So we shall explore, we shall see, and let's look at the poll. What did you guys say? Okay, so it looks like majority of you guys think that Alex O'Connor is not becoming a Christian. So interesting. Some of you do think that he is. Hopefully, maybe this topic will come up with this video. Who knows? We shall see. But in the meantime, let's get into it. Here we go. Why I am a heretical Christian with Philip Goff.
It's giving
Arby's. It's kind of ironic that an Arby's meat commercial shows up right before an Alex O'Connor video. Feels kind of wrong. Feels a bit wrong. For those who don't know, Alex, he was a proponent of veganism for a long time. I think he still is. He's not vegan now, but so he's not so much a proponent of it anymore, but he still believes in the idea of veganism. Oh, I say no, just a grifter. Yeah, I mean, people have been saying that. I don't like to assume bad intent onto people. I like to just try to assume the best of people. But yeah, it could be that that's the case. And hey, if that's what he wants to do, like, all power to him. I'm not here to judge. So, all right, here we go.
Philip Goff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot, Alex. It's been a while. It was one of your first ones, wasn't it, when we last chatted? And God, you done good. The boy done good.
That's right. You saw me sort of lug in a literal suitcase filled with cables and tripods and microphones and just set up in your office for a while. I had this horrible blue light in the background as well that I thought looked good at the time, just like this LED panel. I think we've stepped things up a little bit, but
rings a bell.
That's nothing to do with me.
Dude, whenever I see those kind of like bright lights just in the background, like shining in your eyes, I don't understand it. Like, what are these? Like, I get it's maybe a cool aesthetic, but no, it's just so bad. Like, lights shining straight into your eyes in a video the entire time. To me, it's just blinding. It's really annoying. So I I get where Alex is coming from there. Like, hell no, bro, hell no.
I mean, that's the wonderful team. We can just walk into this beautiful location now, and everything's ready to go. Some other things have changed since then. You believe in God now?
Sort of. Yeah, I mean, I have become religious. I never thought I'd be religious. It's kind of bizarre. And although having said that, I'm a pretty non-standard Christian. You know, I don't believe in the virgin birth. Don't believe in an all-powerful God. I think the Bible's wrong about loads of stuff, and I'm very uncertain as to whether it's all true. So, bit of a non-standard Christian, but yes, even then, I'm still processing what's going on, actually.
Yeah, well, you're sort of a self-described heretical Christian, right?
Yeah.
But I suppose the first step into theism of any kind is the theism part, right? There's usually, I think the story is that somebody becomes kind of convinced that God exists in some form. And then, you know, as C.S. Lewis described mere Christianity, you're sort of in the corridor. And it's great to be in the corridor, but then you have to choose a room. And for him, that was like what form of Christian you are. But for many people, it's what kind of God are we talking about here? So before talking about meaning and purpose in your book, Why, which is the most recent that's been published, you are most known for being a panpsychist philosopher. I've spoken loads about panpsychism. I'm really excited by it. So I think it surprised a lot of people that you would sort of then come out and say, you know, God and religion, this is sort of something I'm really into now. So let's take that first step first. Like, where does or is that how it happened for you? Was it just a sort of general theism of a kind and then Christianity?
It's a bit of both, really. And yeah, I mean, there is a bit of a split in the panpsychist community about this, actually. Some senior members of the profession who will remain nameless got a bit annoyed at me becoming religious. Like, but we're trying to make this serious science. I think there's maybe a split, maybe a little bit like in the early psychoanalytic community, the split between followers of Jung and followers of Freud. So the followers of Jung are into spiritual archetypes and the collective unconscious and all that stuff. And then followers of Freud are like, get rid of all that superstitious nonsense. We're trying to get serious science. So, I mean, I think, God, where to begin? So, I mean, I was raised Catholic, church every week, confession. But, you know, by the time I was 14, decided God obviously doesn't exist. It's a load of bollocks. Refused to get confirmed, upset my grandmother.
Wow.
She forgave me eventually. And
as Christians are prone to do.
She was quite serious about it. And then I was sort of happy atheist for 30 years. I didn't feel there was a God-shaped hole in my life. I think I've just very slowly, over the last decade maybe, come to think that both sides of this never-ending debate between God and atheism, both sides have something they can't explain. So I think theists can't explain suffering. Why would a loving God who can do anything choose to bring us into existence with this horrific process of evolution by natural selection? That makes no sense to me. But I think there's also things atheists can't explain, like the fine-tuning of physics for life, something we've had an argument about. Alex, maybe we can argue about that again today. So I think both sides have things they can't explain. And the theists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning. And what we've neglected in that kind of rigid dichotomy, what we've neglected is the middle way options. So I guess this eventually led to, as you say, my book modestly titled Why, the Purpose of the Universe, which I guess was partly exploring panpsychism as a sort of middle way between God and atheism, and as a way of kind of integrating our scientific and our spiritual yearnings.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I just want to say at the outset, I love the just like rawness and like the just authenticity. It's like, bro, I'm just exploring, and you know, we do get into these rigid debates a lot of the time. And I think it's very healthy to just sit back and say, look, there's a middle path. There isn't just, I'm a Christian, I'm an atheist. You know, those are such limited labels. But there's so many ways of understanding the world. There's so much exploration and questions that still need to be answered. And I think the best thing that we can do is be agnostic and search for a solution that accounts for everything, that accounts for all the quandaries, all of the sort of things that don't quite add up. So I love this. This is really cool. So I'm excited to see how he fits together panpsychism and a belief in a personal God. It sounds like a personal God.
And yeah, so that's the start of it, really, I think.
So it wasn't like some kind of, here's an interesting argument for the existence of God, and suddenly it's like, now I believe that there's this kind of, this figure or this creative power that brought the universe into existence. It was more the result of just an exploration of your panpsychist philosophy in the face of one big particular mystery that the atheist faces, which is something like the fine-tuning of the universe.
I think there are head and heart things going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the head stuff, the intellectual stuff, yeah, I think that was what's driving me. Primarily the fine-tuning, some other more fiddly stuff to do with consciousness. And it took me a while to admit there was something going on here. I think in Western intellectual circles, we're raised to sort of be very wary of religious bias.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you just believe in God because you were brought up that way. But I think there's also secular bias. I feel silly talking in front of my peers about fine-tuning and the purpose of the universe. And that's a very powerful groupthink that was very hard to overcome. But, I had to, at some point, face up to the fact that I just think in our standard ways of thinking about evidence, this recent scientific discovery is not evidence for the traditional God necessarily, but let's put it this way, for something God-ish.
Mm.
And then, but at the same time, I've for all my life, as far as I can remember, like yourself, Alex, been totally persuaded by the problem of evil. So I was sort of wrestling back and forth with this conundrum being how I thought of it was being pulled in two different directions. And then I think at some point I just kind of a eureka moment that these are not necessarily pulling in different directions. There are, for example, forms of panpsychism. I explore other options in the White Book that can accommodate both the fine-tuning and explain the suffering. You can have your cake and eat it. So we don't have to choose.
Mm.
I love this. To me, it's like getting at the heart of what Treebeard said in Lord of the Rings. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, Treebeard, I can pull up a picture of the guy, but he says that I am on nobody's side because nobody is on my side. And his side is the trees. So this guy right here, Treebeard, he's an ent. I love it. Side, I am on nobody's side because nobody's on my side. This guy just is emulating Treebeard to me. I love it. Oh, it's so good. Dude, there was so many references in there. So if you are following along with the bingo card, go ahead and knock some stuff out. For me, I think it was consciousness over here. So I did that one. And then did they mention evolution? I feel like they probably mentioned evolution. Let me know if they mentioned evolution. I don't know if they mentioned that at all. Psychedelics was mentioned in the earlier conversation. Quantum physics was also mentioned. So a lot of these are here. Oh, I think they mentioned slavery too with Problem of Evil. Let me know in the comments. Did they mention slavery and did they mention evolution? Those are the ones. Because if that's the case, all I need is for him to mention that he was an altar boy. And we'll have a bingo. But yeah, check your stuff. Do you have a bingo? And we'll get right back to the content. Here we go. Psych, maybe not back. An ad break. All right, here we go.
So we did a whole episode on panpsychism. It was the first time I was introduced to the idea, and I'm indebted to you because it's now become one of my favorite ideas in philosophy. I think it's
You're getting into
so
it,
plausible, it's not even funny.
I didn't see that coming, I must say. But yeah,
well, I feel similarly, I suppose, to you in that if myself from, say, 10 years ago wouldn't have been saying too much because I was, a teenager, but could have heard me now talking about consciousness as fundamental, at least without getting into too much detail, I would have thought that I'd lost my mind, if you will.
Right.
And in a way, I feel like I kind of have, and I've submitted it to the foundational consciousness of everything that the universe is made out of. But
So Alex may or may not becoming a Christian, but one thing he has admitted is that he's losing his mind. You can put that one on the bingo card. I don't think it's there, but he's losing his mind, I guess.
kind of know what you mean. You sort of, after some time, you sort of have to think, okay, something's definitely going on here. And what I'm interested in is the details here, right? Because you say that you're confronted with fine-tuning, which, and I should say, the reason I brought that up is because if you don't know what panpsychism is, it's the view that the universe is made up fundamentally of conscious material, or that matter itself is consciousness or has conscious properties. And if you're interested, we had that whole episode which people can go and listen to, or just, Wikipedia it. I don't want to waste too much time going over that again, but just so people know what that is. And it seems like you can sort of shelve that, and then you've got this problem of fine-tuning, which is the issue of the constants of the universe. Things like the strength of gravity, the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold the universe together. In principle, there seems to be no reason why these constants couldn't have been different. These forces could have been stronger or weaker. And if gravity had been stronger by even an unfathomably minute proportion, the whole universe would collapse in on itself. And if it were any weaker, then the universe would fly apart at the Big Bang and atoms wouldn't be able to form. And so everything is very, very finely balanced. And so confronted with this, many people say that the only options are that it's chance, which seems completely ludicrous. It's just so unlikely. Or that there's a multiverse, which is one version of chance. It's really, really unlikely, but there are so many different iterations that one of them is going to be this universe. And the third is to say it was designed that way.
Yeah.
That's the classical response to the fine-tuning. It sounds like, the way you just presented it then wasn't like that. It wasn't like you were confronted with these and you went with design and now you're a theist. So it seems like something else is going on. So in the face of fine-tuning, you're a panpsychist, you think the universe is made out of consciousness, you're not a theist yet. What is the response to fine-tuning that makes you now say that you're maybe a bit religious?
Yeah, I think panpsychism offers us a really nice solution to the fine-tuning problem. So I guess the people on the theistic side of things usually postulate a supernatural designer who's fixed the numbers to make sure we can get life. But if you're a panpsychist and you think the universe is conscious, which is one prominent form of panpsychism that I've defended among other forms, often known as cosmopsychism, that the universe itself is the fundamental conscious thing. So if you're starting there, then that opens up the possibility that maybe the universe has goals of its own. And maybe we don't need a supernatural designer outside of the universe. Maybe the universe fine-tuned itself. So I think this offers a quite nice, elegant solution. We don't need loads of other universes. We don't need something supernatural and very different. We just need the universe itself, designing itself.
It reminds me of an idea that I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson bring up one time, which is basically the notion that the universe produced what it has produced, specifically consciousness, as a way of getting to know itself. So consciousness exists in the universe because, you are made of this universe. I'm part of this universe in a materialistic sense. Everyone is a part of the universe. And the reason consciousness exists in a poetic sense is so that the universe can get to know itself. I mean, I don't have any reason to doubt that or to accept that. So I'm very agnostic to that idea, but it's a very poetic idea. It's a pretty interesting idea. It's a fun, interesting thought. So leave that as it may. Take that as it may. But to me, that seems to be very similar to what he's saying here, which is that the universe is having its own sort of agenda. My question then is, are you saying that the universe is sort of integrated together in a single consciousness and is aware of said agenda, or if the agenda is, say, just built into what the universe is? Because there's two different ideas here. Panpsychism separates consciousness, because it doesn't say that, this is important. Panpsychism does not say that consciousness is the culmination of everything in the universe, right? That consciousness is basically like the entire universe together is that which is conscious, right? It says that consciousness exists at the most minute level. So when we get to the smallest particles, say like an electron, that is where consciousness resides. An electron, in a sense, is consciousness. And so it's a ton of pieces of consciousness here and there and there and there, pixels of consciousness, right? Everywhere in the universe. And that when you kind of combine things and create a system, it then becomes its own entity, its own sort of ego or sense of self that becomes conscious. So you believe that you are a singular entity, even though you are made up of fundamental conscious particles. And in that combination, you have an ego, your own personal ego or sense of self. So that's panpsychism. What he seems to be suggesting, though, is slightly different, which is it's not that consciousness is separated at the fundamental level, and when combined, you can create systems that create a vision of connected consciousness and a sense of an ego that doesn't actually truly exist, but that consciousness is not just at the minute level, but the universe as a whole is conscious. And so you don't really separate consciousness into like this electron's its own felt experience, that electron has its own felt experience, this quark has its own felt experience. No. But that the entirety of the universe together, it has its own consciousness, and we can kind of separate that into its own entity. So it's a little bit different. I don't know if that's clear or making sense. Let me know in the comments if that makes sense. So it does seem to be a little bit different from the, I guess, normal presentation that Alex favors in terms of panpsychism. So that's very interesting. To me, that potentially leaves a problem of like, why is there no sense in which I can interact with your consciousness, right? If consciousness is the entirety of the universe, why is there no like situation where I sometimes tap into like my neighbor's consciousness? I'd be curious what he has to say to that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the problem, but it seems interesting.
Now, you had a debate with William Lane Craig not that long ago. It's quite extraordinary. I think you really sort of go to blows a bit in that. It's really interesting to watch. And one of the things that he pointed out that didn't get a lot of airtime was that he thought there was a circularity here, because the fine-tuning is needed to explain the existence of the universe. I mean, the idea is that without these constants being tuned as they are, the universe just kind of couldn't form. You wouldn't have atoms, you wouldn't have matter, you wouldn't have anything going on, at least in a way that makes sense to us in this universe. And so to say that the universe itself is some kind of conscious agent, William Lane Craig wants to say, well, in order to get that conscious agent, there had to have been finely tuned constants to bring about this conscious agent. So it can't have been that conscious agent that did the tuning. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, here I kind of cheekily borrow from multiverse theorists. So they tend to postulate slightly speculatively, but rooted in kind of string theory, and I mean the fact that our current models kind of collapse in the so-called Planck epoch, the first split second of the universe. They speculate that though in the very early universe there was some sort of flexibility. The constants weren't set in stone, and there's some kind of random processes fixing what the constants end up at. And then they think there's so many universes connected to eternal inflation. They think there's so many universes with each getting their constants fixed kind of randomly at the start that, one of them's going to fluke the right numbers for life. If enough people are playing the lottery, someone's going to win. So basically, I can take that picture that there's a very early period in our universe where there's some flexibility, where the constants are not determined, but rather than being determined by random processes, they are determined by the universe itself. And that way we don't need other universes. And if you're already in the ballpark of being, a panpsychist, and if it's not like an extra speculation, then it seems like a saving to not have to postulate loads of other universes.
I suppose it will feel like a lot to swallow if you're just sort of your average Joe, a physicalist, materialist guy. If you're not already a bit on board with panpsychism as you were.
Yeah.
And you can sort of imagine saying, hey guys, like, I've got this argument that God exists. Okay, first you have to accept that the universe is conscious and made out of conscious. It's like, well, okay, stop there. So in telling your story, it makes perfect sense to say, well, look, if the universe is conscious, we have this lovely solution. I just want our listeners to be aware that we're not trying to say here, like, this conversation we're having now should convince you of God's existence.
Sure.
But rather, this is how you and your philosophy will slot into something like theism. But okay, so universe being conscious, and as I say, reasons why you think that are all over the internet and people can find them in your writings. You've got this sort of universe that's conscious, and this early period of the universe. The questions that jump out to me are, firstly, there still will remain this question of, like, where that came from. Like, what got that off the ground? I mean, even if everything's made out of consciousness, you might still have this sort of causal argument that says that there are these causal relations between material object, and even if it's made out of consciousness, it still abides by causal laws, and you want to explain sort of how that got going. And secondly, like, how you characterize this very early state of the universe, this sort of, very chaotic state. Have you got a bunch of individual sort of fundamental units that all have a particular kind of rudimentary will, that all like will towards the production of the universe? Or are they kind of randomly bumping into each other until they form a kind of conscious whole? Or is it already a conscious whole? Where does it come from, and what is the nature of the thing that first exists?
Excellent. Two very good questions. So on the first point, I mean, look, there's two very different arguments for God, or that are traditionally put in support of God. One is this fine-tuning stuff. How do you get the right numbers for life? Another is what we call the cosmological argument. Where does the universe come from in the first place? Why is there something rather than nothing? So suppose, I mean, if you were just convinced by the fine-tuning stuff, and you just didn't buy the cosmological argument, you're happy to go with Bertrand Russell and say it just is brute fact. That's all there is. Well, then you can just say, well, the universe just exists. It's just brute fact. It came into existence, and then it fine-tuned itself. So you've got an answer to the fine-tuning, but you don't care about the cosmological argument.
That's a pretty interesting way to respond to the cosmological argument. I think there's potentially better ways to respond to it. There's this sense in which the Big Bang is like truly the beginning. But there are philosophers Alex has had on his podcast that mentioned the notion that the Big Bang is merely the beginning of our universe, but not the beginning of everything. And that when we think of the Big Bang, we tend to think of this idea of like a singular quark-sized universe that expanded. It was a hot, dense state, all kind of combined into a singular quark-sized entity, and then slowly expanded over time. Well, that's one view, and that's actually not the dominant view for physicists about the Big Bang. There's a lot of people that they agree that it's a hot, dense state, but they don't think that it's this sort of expansion that is often depicted, but rather a more vibration, a sound wave that occurs. it's been a while since I listened to that episode, so you should definitely don't take my word for it, but you can check out. Let me quickly find it real quick. Okay, I will point you in the right direction of it in a moment. I'll continue to play it, but basically the notion is that it's a reverberation process that is the beginning of a singular universe, which is our universe, but not necessarily the beginning of everything. And so there's the beginning of time in the sense of the moments of our universe, but there could have been moments prior to that before the Big Bang in the sense of like moment to moment thinking of time, but not in the sense of like time as we know it in our universe, which is measured, right? So I will continue to play this. I'll find that video I was referring to because I have not studied that super well and I might be butchering the explanation. So apologies if that is the case. And if you have a rebuttal, feel free to share it in the comments below. But I will find that and share the information with you.
With Craig. Yeah, my debate with Craig was interesting. Usually with debates, I like to kind of make it more of a discussion, I see what you're saying. I see, I can see there's some truth to. But then I was talking to someone about this and saying, Craig's not going to do that. Craig's going to prepare to destroy you. So I responded in kind. But I think it was a friendly, spirited debate.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it
wasn't
was
nasty, that's fine.
As you say, spirited. You were sort of getting into it, and there were points where you're sort of saying, "Look, you just said something it's just wrong. It's just false," and Craig's like, "You're just digging yourself into a hole." But I do think it had a sort of friendly vibe.
He was telling me I'd got Dale Allison, the biblical scholar, wrong.
Yeah.
And I happen to have a quote from his book available to me.
Yeah.
I was quite proud.
I remember because you were like, "Well, I've got a quote from Dale Allison," and he was like, "Well, I just emailed Dale Allison," and then you were like, "Well, I just went for coffee with it." Well, Dale Allison's my dad, and it just seemed like it could just.
Oh, Dale Allison's such a sweet guy. I love that. So I found it here. I'm gonna show you guys. It's this video here. Does quantum physics make sense yet? Oh wait, no, that's not it. No, it's this one. Okay, I'm sorry. It's this one. What came before the Big Bang, the latest evidence. And so they have a book discussing that, the beginning of the universe, all of those juicy good stuff. I got a comment here. The stash denotes his post, Annika Harris discussion, and the fact that he entertains panpsychism now and consciousness being fundamental. Pre-stash Alex questioned religion. Post-stash Alex questions materialism. That I love that. That's such a good post. You're probably right. Is that when he got the stash? Let me look. Hold up. I think you're right. Annika Harris is somewhere over here. Here it is. Yeah, he had a bit more of scruff. And this is his next episode. I guess he has scruff there too, but this is where he explores consciousness post the Annika Harris episode, and he has a stash. He has a stash, guys. He has a stash. Oh my God. You are so right. You're spitting bars right now. That's crazy. I love it. That's true. You know what? It's so true. The post stash, he just hates materialism. Anti-materialist over here. I love that. That's really funny. Yeah, I think it is very interesting. And I think a lot of Christians, or just religious people in general, when you critique materialism, they assume that you're critiquing atheism, which is not true. You're just critiquing materialism. You can still be an atheist and reject materialism. Those two ideas tend to be coincided together. But atheists tend to be more favoring naturalism, meaning all that exists is just nature, right? But the question is, what is nature made of? And if nature is made of consciousness, like in panpsychism, then you can be a naturalist, but also reject materialism because at the basis of everything is consciousness. Or like Bernardo Kasparov tends to think it's the mind, and that everything, the entirety of the universe is the mind, and that there's individual egos that exist. Nothing truly exists outside of that which is the mind, and the physical things that we see, the material things that we see, is merely a projection of the mind. And so in a sense, illusions are just as real as the physical world. It's a crazy episode. Definitely check it out. I love Bernardo Kasparov. He's probably one of my favorite thinkers right now. His stuff on free will, because he's a determinist, is crazy. Super, super interesting stuff there. So, but we'll get back to the conversation here. But yeah, I just had to shout that out. Super, I love it. The stash thing. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. It's great.
Sort of keep going on forever.
Yeah, Dale has, he's been very formative in my turn to heretical Christianity, actually, and his views on the resurrection have led me to sort of non-standard view of the resurrection. Anyway,
yeah. Well, we'll talk about that.
Let's not drift off topic. Yeah, but so suppose you are convinced that there has to be. Let's say you think there has.
I want him to drift off topic. I want to hear what are your thoughts on the resurrection? Ugh, is he gonna talk about it? Please tell me he's gonna talk about it. Let's see. Does he talk about the resurrection here? The problem of suffering, non-Western religious position. Maybe there could be the resurrection there. What is the role of Jesus in this? The point in maybe here. The beautiful answer. Okay. There's a lot of potential areas in which he does talk about the resurrection. So cross my fingers. Hopefully he does talk about the resurrection, because I'd be so interested to hear how does that relate to your views. It's so interesting. Wow.
Has to be a necessary being. Because otherwise there's no explanation of where it all came from. There has to be something that had to exist that created everything else. Well, in that case, and this is what I explore actually in my academic version of this, I've got an academic paper, Did the Universe Design Itself? And you could just say, well, the universe is a necessary being. And it didn't always, so then you might think, well, doesn't that mean it's eternal? Or you could say its temporal form is just one stage of the universe's existence. So the universe, if it's a necessary being, maybe before the Big Bang or before the start of time, it existed in a timeless form, and it then became a time-bound physical entity. And then if your Christian's going to say, well, that doesn't make sense. How can something necessary become physical? I'm going to say, have you heard of Jesus?
Yeah. And interestingly, William Lane Craig has this view of God, not just in the form of Jesus, but Craig himself thinks that God was timeless, and then upon creating the universe, entered into time.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people look on with suspicion, but it's not, like, this isn't a view that's unique to what you're saying here. But it does sound like, fair enough, but haven't we just got a terminological dispute here? Because what you're postulating is a necessarily...
To me, that seems like another hard problem. That's, instead of it being how does consciousness interact with the material world, if everything is material, right? That's one hard problem. Another hard problem, though, for me in this is how does a timeless being, someone that is outside of time, interact with time? How does he enter time? Because that requires a specific time for him to enter, which assumes then that being is within time. So to me, that I haven't actually heard any good arguments in favor of that. My first episode of Truth and Tradition actually kind of tackles this topic, so go and check that out. But it basically mentions the idea that God cannot be a being that you ever truly interact with, but instead the decrees that he makes, it becomes sort of an entity that you interact with. So that's a notion that Augustine proposes as a solution to this, that you never actually truly pray to God, but instead that God is this sort of being that exists and created everything, and everything within time never actually prays to or interacts with God, but instead interacts with the decrees, the predestined decisions, because Calvinism, right? I mean, this is before Calvinism, but it's the kind of prefront of Calvinistic philosophy, is this idea that God decreed it to be, and that's what you truly interact with, is the decrees of God and not truly God himself. Graham Oppy flirts with substituting the necessary being with the quantum field, but I don't find that position defensible, and I don't think he does either. Otherwise, he'd take that position. Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. The quantum field. Yeah. So I haven't heard him mention that before, but it would be an interesting thing. If you have a video or a article or something to point me to, I would definitely love to check that out. So, but that's an interesting point. Was thinking of this about the timeline of God now, and for them to be inside time is the instruction of Jesus. Just thinking aloud, or what do you think about the timeline of God now, and for them to be inside time is the instruction of Jesus? I don't know if I fully understand what your comment is, Shea. What do you mean when you say timeless of God now, and then to be inside time is the instruction? Oh, introduction of Jesus. Oh, okay. That makes sense. So like the incarnation itself is the thing that caused God to be within time. I mean, you could say that. There's still a lot of problems in that, because if the essence of God, right, in the Trinity, it's the notion that God is three persons, but one in essence. And so if Jesus is part of the Trinity and is one in essence with God, how does something that is essentially at its essence not able to, outside of time, how does that create, and also immaterial, I think there's two problems there. How does something like that become a human and then also interact with time, which is something they mentioned, which is like, if you believe in the incarnation, then you can just say that a being like that can do that. I think there is an interaction problem. It doesn't really make sense. How can we sort of have these two separate concepts and then somehow they interact and combine together? I think it is still a problem, but potentially that's the solution there. Again, this is just kind of a mystery in terms of Christian thought. Time, okay, not timelines, but timeliness. Perhaps God's ontological nature relative to time, or eternalism. Timelines, but timeliness. So when you say, instead of timelines, you're saying timeliness, are you referring to the notion of like moments instead of like the notion of like a measurable timeline of events, but just like in a moment? I guess I don't know the difference, what you're referring to as timeliness versus timeline. Again, this is a topic that I've not explored enough to truly, I think, appreciate it. Yes, timeliness. How would you guys define timeliness versus timeline? Because timeline is the idea of like, this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, right? And in Calvinism or Molinism, there would be God selects the timeline of the universal events. And so he could have selected this, but instead he selects this specific timeline that will produce the most good. So that's kind of how I see like timeline. But then timeliness, I guess I'm failing to grasp what do you mean by that? How is timeliness different than timeline? So I mean, it's an interesting thought though, because time's always so complicated. Time also just seems like, honestly, just like a made up thing, in the sense of like we are trying to understand the notion of moments and one moment compared to another moment. And we create this system of measuring such a thing, and we call that time. So then when we're talking about the moments from moment to moment to moment, or experiences to experience to experience, it's actually slightly different than the concept of measured time, like minutes, hours, years. Those kind of things are measurements of said thing. But it's hard to think about what time actually is outside of the measurement itself, especially if there's no beings there. But if there is a universe that is conscious, then in a sense, that would be the being that is there, in a panpsychist perspective. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to understand what you're trying to say there. But I think where I'm getting caught up is the notion of timeline versus timeliness. So if you have a way of describing that, feel free to let me know. I'll continue the video.
Existing conscious agent which gives rise to all physical matter and human beings and human consciousness and all of that kind of stuff. Isn't that just the same thing as what the traditional Christian says? And if it's not, what is your view here? Is it a kind of like pantheism? I mean, pantheism is usually described as the view that God just is nature or the universe, and it kind of sounds like maybe that's what you're describing, but I don't know how comfortable you are with that label.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of this as a form of pantheism. So, I mean, I think that there are two attractions to it. One is parsimony. It's a more parsimonious conception of the divine because it's not something outside of the universe. You might think it's extravagant already to think the universe is conscious, but if you get into the panpsychism literature, I think it's actually, pretty motivated, but that's another discussion.
Parsimonious meaning sort of simple or elegant, or like lacking too many seemingly unnecessary complications.
Exactly. Respecting Occam's razor. So that's one attraction, but I think the more important thing that's motivating me is the problem of evil and suffering. So as I'm thinking of this conscious universe, it's not an all-powerful being. I mean, so it's an interesting question, how do the laws of physics fit in here, right? If you're thinking, okay, there's this conscious being with goals that is the universe, or what about the laws of physics that scientists seem to be telling us about? As I've developed this book, how we think of the laws of physics, what they're doing is recording the limitations, the constraints of the universe. And when I say constraint, it's not that I'm not thinking that there's something outside of the universe that's constraining it. It's just a fundamental fact that the conscious universe can do some things, can't do others, and physics is my philosophical interpretation of the laws of physics is it's capturing the limitations of the universe.
Wow.
And actually, what I like about this theory is I think you can give those limitations very simply, right? You just take physics, take out the values of the constants. That will give you a certain mathematical structure. And then the thought is the universe is able and is only able to create a universe with that structure, but can fiddle with the constants. So that's simpler than physics, right? So that's pretty damn simple. And I mean, you can capture it more precisely with a little logical tool called a Ramsey sentence, named after Frank Ramsey, who was, I don't you know Frank Ramsey, Alex, who was died at the age of 26 after making fundamental contributions to philosophy, economics, mathematics, and then died at the age of 26. Very impressive. Anyway, but we maybe won't go into those sort of fiddly details. But yeah, so it's a very nice, simple, precise hypothesis, deals with the fine-tuning, deals with the suffering. What's not to like?
Would you call it pantheism?
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it, just by thinking about it.
Pantheism. We'll see if Goff's a pantheist now.
I'm happy with that.
In a way, like, who cares? You
Yeah,
know, like, you probably spend a lot of time at the moment.
I hate terminological disputes. You know, these sort of, I use that word. I suppose when I was first talking about this, I wasn't using that language for kind of PR reasons, maybe,
Yeah,
to
right,
try, you know, persuade my secular colleagues that there's something worth thinking about here. But I'm kind of a bit of a religious person these days, so I'm
So
happy with that.
Why not own it? I think this is really interesting, right? The view that I would describe as a kind of pantheism. The universe kind of is what you might call God, but the universe is this sort of conscious, possibly necessary. I want to say possibly necessary, but that means it's necessary. So, you know, a necessary existing being who's conscious, who gives light, like rise to everything, but is the same thing as the universe. And like you say, the laws of physics are a record of the limitations that just exist.
Yeah.
You know, when you figure out that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, that's not because of some decision that was made. That's just a limitation of the universe that we are just sort of noticing, observing, right?
Yeah.
But the question that's going to arise is why? Why that limitation? I mean, the speed of light is what, 300 million something, you know, meters per second. Why not 400? Why not 200? You know, why there? Why precisely? It doesn't seem logically necessary. And you seem to sort of get this, maybe not a fine-tuning argument back, but something a bit like it, of like, why is the universe limited in this way, but not limited in another way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say you can never get rid of all the why questions. So even the traditional theists are left with, why is there an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being? Why does God exist? I guess if you buy the ontological argument, you don't know, but I don't think that argument works. So I think that even the traditional theist has to just say, well, that's a why question I can't answer. That's just, at least relative to human understanding, is just a brute fact. Now, I accept I've got a few more why questions. Their view is a little bit simpler than mine. I concede to them that it's simpler to say God is all-powerful than that God has these limitations, even if you can quite precisely and simply specify the limitations. It adds a bit of complexity. But my view accounts for the data better. And I think that's what we try and do in science and philosophy. Yeah, you go for the simplest view you can, but ultimately you want to fit the data. Actually, Richard Swinburne has this.
I want to mention the comment here because we were talking about time there earlier, and Kafi, I think. Let me know if I'm pronouncing the name right. But you said, I think he is referring to, this is in reference to timeline versus timeliness, referring to theology, the nature of God as the ground of being, the timeless ground which underlies and includes all time, as in the eternalism of Augustine of Hippo. So that makes a lot of sense. We still get the interaction problem between us beings who are within time and God. But if God grounds time, then we have the interaction problem between us and God, but we don't necessarily have the interaction problem between God and us if he's the one that grounds time. He's outside of time, but grounds it, so not bound by it, as Shea said. Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I appreciate, thank you for that explanation. So that's definitely a topic I want to explore a little bit more, but that's very fascinating. So I like that, the idea of God bounds time. He's not within time, but he bounds, or time is bound within him. He's not bound by time. So in a sense, we can't interact with God, but God can interact with us in that view, and then could potentially become a human in that sense, in the incarnation. Okay, I'll have to think about that a little bit more, but I think I understand that, so I appreciate that. Thank you for the explanation.
Analogy in his book, The Existence of God, which I think works in my favor. So he tells us that we used to think the speed of light was infinite, because that's a very simple value, just being infinite. zero or infinity are very simple. But of course, when we get evidence to the contrary, that it's some finite speed, we don't sort of try and tie ourselves in knots to think it's still infinite. No, we go, we want our theory to be simple, but we want it to fit the data. So likewise, an all-powerful God is the simple hypothesis, but it doesn't fit the bloody data of suffering. And so we shouldn't tie ourselves up in knots trying to keep a simple theory. We should add a little bit of complexity to the theory to better fit the data. And I think that's what, just finally, I think insofar as I'm a religious believer, I guess maybe if you really understood the essence of God, you'd just see God has to exist. I think that would be really satisfying. Oh my God, this has to exist. And on my view, you'd see, God has to have these limitations. That's something totally beyond human understanding. And so these things are just brute fact for us humans, but that's the same for the traditional theist.
I think that's what the ontological argument is supposed to provide. At least those, Bertrand Russell himself at one point says that he was sort of walking home, and I think he sort of like throws his can of tobacco in the air, and by the time he catches it, he says, "By Jove, the ontological argument is sound." And even though I think he later sort of retracted the thought, he had this moment of like apprehension of just like, oh, yeah, God exists. He has to. It's just like it sort of presents itself to the intellect. Interestingly, as far as I'm aware, because of relativity and how time dilation works, if you were a photon of light, which is a weird thing to say to anyone other than a panpsychist, perhaps, but photons having no mass, traveling at the speed of light, the faster you travel, like the slower time is for you relative to everybody else. If you're a photon of mass, for us, it might take 8 minutes for a photon to get from the sun to Earth. But
it's instant for the photon.
As far as the photon's concerned, it's the same instant.
Yeah.
Because for the photon, time moves slower and slower the faster you get. And if you get to the fastest possible speed, that time just sort of shrinks to zero. So for the photon, it leaves the sun and hits the Earth in the same instant, which is perhaps relevant here to those who are a bit mystified by the precision of this number. Why this particular number? That might just be because of where we are in relation to light in terms of the amount of mass that we have. But it still seems a little bit mysterious. And you say, yeah, I've still got why questions, but so do the theists. But there seem to be like satisfying answers here. Like even in traditional theism, God has some limitations. You could characterize it that way. For example, famously, he can't make a rock so heavy he can't lift it. Why not? Because he can't perform logical contradictions. Right? And somebody might come along and say, well, why can't God do a contradiction? And it seems like you can think to yourself, well, can he make P true and false at the same time? It just doesn't seem like conceivable, and it seems just quite satisfying to say that's just not a thing. That's just not possible.
Yeah.
In a way that when you say, well, God just, couldn't make something travel faster than the speed of light, or God couldn't make gravity stronger, I don't have the same intuitive sense of like, yeah, fair enough, that just doesn't seem possible, because it seems perfectly possible to me. So for that reason, in terms of the limits that God has, I'm much more intuitively able to accept the traditional theistic view than this view that God is the universe and has a really large amount of power, but for some reason is limited in very specific kinds of ways in terms of how electricity sort of manifests and interacts with other electrical sources, and the strength of magnets and gravity, and that it just seems so specific and ordered and systematized that it seems weird to think of it in the same way that the traditional theist thinks of like, oh well, God just can't do a contradiction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but don't we have...
That makes sense. That's a pretty interesting thought. He did mention if P and Q. So I have it here, if P then Q, which I know is a different philosophical concept, but for the sake of getting that bingo, man, if you have if P then Q on your bingo card, feel free to mark that off. I will probably just change that to P and Q, I think, for the future. But yeah, fun.
You have the same thing with God's existence. Like, why does God have to exist? It seems conceivable that God doesn't exist. So that also seems like a brute fact. God just has to exist.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm positing is in the same ballpark. Why does God have these limitations? We just have to accept that as a brute fact. So it's a slight cost of the theory.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, I think the theist is doing something similar, but I'm doing it a little bit more.
Right.
But look, okay, you have to, it's a trade-off. But look, compared to explaining suffering, I think I've just got a much better explanation of suffering. I mean, I root my version of the problem of evil, what I call the cosmic sin intuition.
Mm. I
just think it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create a universe like this. And theists say, I had a debate with Richard Swinburne. They say there's certain goods that you couldn't get without what uses free will, and you need natural evil for certain goods, certain serious moral choices and stuff. I'm happy to say, okay, yeah, maybe that's all true. Maybe there are goods that we need suffering for. Still, I think it's immoral for a creator to kill and maim in order to bring about those goods. I think it's like the classic the challenge to utilitarianism, where, suppose there's a doctor who has 5 ill patients, one's missing a heart, one's missing kidneys and so on. The doctor could kidnap one healthy patient, harvest their organs and save 5 lives. Okay, it's a better world. We've saved 5 lives at the cost of 1. But most of us say, no, that's immoral. That's taking that person's right to life. Likewise, I think if a God creates hurricanes and cancer that kill people in order to get these goods, that's wrong. So that to me, avoiding that is much more significant than adding a little bit of complexity to our fundament.
That makes a lot of sense. I actually like that example, I think, a little bit more than the example Alex tends to give, which is the example of like chemotherapy is a good thing. We view chemotherapy as a good thing because it helps solve the problem of cancer. But what would be better is, just not having cancer in general. I think that analogy fails in that it's this idea of greater goods that could not exist without the problem. I would not consider chemotherapy a greater good. I would consider it a solution to a existing problem. But things like bravery are greater goods that can happen because of problems, right? But the example that Goff gave here, which is the idea of saving 5 people's lives, which is a greater good. But in order to do that, you have to kill an innocent, healthy person and harvest their organs to save the 5 lives. I think that's a great example because saving 5 lives is a greater good compared to saving 1 life. And yet, in that example, we are actively causing harm, actively participating in evil in order to solve the solution, to make the solution. So that's a great example. I really appreciate that. Very, very good.
Mental theory.
Yeah. It also just feels a bit too easy, I think. Like, in the abstract, for me, the problem of suffering isn't so much the existence of any form of suffering, but like the extent and depth and arbitrariness of it all, in that, like, it's very easy to say, well, without fear, you couldn't have bravery. Without suffering, you couldn't have good things. But like,
starting a fashion brand shouldn't feel impossible.
For a start, I agree with you. It's a little bit like being grateful for the existence of cancer, because now we have the good of chemotherapy, which you wouldn't be able to have if you didn't have cancer. It's like, I think I'd rather have neither. We couldn't have Martin Luther King if we didn't have racism. It's like, I know it sounds really kind of weird on the surface level to say I'd rather Martin Luther King didn't exist, but I'd rather have neither than both of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's also like, I mean, I just had a back and forth with on this Diary of a CEO podcast with, I've forgotten his name, the Stand to Reason Christian guy who was across from me. It was the first time I've met him. And at one point, Stephen Bartlett, the host, we're talking about meaning, and there's Dr. K as well, who's next to me. And he sort of says, but what if, young Stephen had gotten cancer? Like, what's the meaning and purpose of that? And I watched him, I think his name's Greg, I watched him say, well, we live in a fallen world and Adam and Eve sinned. And I kind of had to stop and like wait for my turn to speak again and be like, can we just go back a second? Like, I really want to drill this down. Do you mean, and it transpires that he believes in a literal sort of first human of some kind, not quite sure when, but that they literally committed some kind of transgression that, and I'm like, so you think that children get cancer because maybe 2 million years ago or so, somebody literally like ate a fruit? Once you actually start cashing out how this works in practice, it just seems so deeply unsatisfying. So I agree with you that this is a huge motivation. And I suppose you've got this idea that, well, there's a God, but this God is limited in power. And you said it would be immoral if there were a sort of all-powerful being to bring about suffering. But the question that jumps out to me is like, why limit the power? Why not just limit the goodness? You know, why not say, well, God is all-powerful, but not all good? Because that seems to be a more popular response from people who aren't convinced of a traditional God because of suffering. They say, okay, God exists, but you know, he's either amoral or immoral. But you don't do that. You seem committed to the view that God is good.
Well, I think we should consider all these possibilities, and in the Why book, I consider various options. I'm not a dogmatic person, as you might have noticed. But I think, well, if you suppose you have a bad God who's all powerful, I think the problem with that, as Stephen Law and others have explored, is it creates the kind of mirror image of the problem of evil, the problem of the good. If there's a really bad God, why create the lovely things, you know, flowers and why can't I think of lovely things? the smile of a baby,
and the laughter of a podcast host.
I could easily give examples.
This reminds me. So I'm currently watching his entire series from kind of start to finish, and every once in a while I'll watch kind of a latest episode like this one. But in one of the recent episodes that I listened to, he talked to Earthling Ed about veganism in that podcast. It was like his 9th podcast or something like that. Back then it was called the Cosmic Skeptic Podcast. Anyway, in that episode, the conversation's all about veganism and everything, but it just takes this really dark turn where Earthling Ed basically says, yeah, I think nature is mostly suffering, and it's actually mostly really bad stuff. And then Alex responds and says, well, if you're a utilitarian then in that belief system, maybe it's just better to kill all of life and end everything. And Earthling Ed was like, yeah. I was like, listen to that. I was like, holy shit, that just randomly got really existential and dark. But I mean, if everything is mostly evil and you are a utilitarian and you want the most good for the greatest number of people, if it is inevitable, as long as a conscious being exists, that it will be mostly suffering, then the best thing you can do is annihilate all existence. Thanos style sort of deal. I don't think that is the case. I do not agree with that. And even if it was the case in terms of like looking at nature at its most raw, the fact that we have progressed as a society and achieved more comforts and more kind of pleasure and goods for society. This is from a utilitarian view where pleasure's well-being's at the basis. I think we then have an argument in favor of, sure, maybe nature has mostly bad, but we can expect through this trajectory of time that eventually the good will win out. So annihilating everything is actually not good. We should not annihilate everything because we're on a trajectory toward good being the favorable thing and all. And I mean, as a human, I don't think that that's the case. I think mostly it's a mixed bag, but I would say there's probably more good than bad. Maybe that's the optimist in me talking. But anyway, it's a very interesting topic here. And when we think about like an all-powerful God who is amoral, that makes sense. But an all-powerful God who is immoral, as well as just an all-powerful God who is moral, I think that also is problematic in a lot of different senses. So, no, although I'd love for that to happen since I want to be a Christian. LOL. Yeah, so it's definitely that end of things is very dark, but hopefully you guys have hope and joy in life, and hopefully this podcast can bring you some hope and joy and not just gloominess. So focus on the laughter of the podcast host and you'll be fine, right?
Symbols of pain and suffering, and then
Yeah.
what does that say? This is turning into a therapy session.
Yeah. So, but okay.
But yeah, so that's one problem. Yeah, you get the mirror image, so that's no good.
But then it's like you could say, okay, there's the problem of evil makes us think there can't be a perfectly good, all-powerful God. The problem of good makes us think there can't be a perfectly evil, all-powerful God. So what about an all-powerful God who's just amoral? I mean, the universe is conscious, but it sort of doesn't have moral preferences. It's just, a bunch of atoms want to do this and a bunch of molecules want to do that, and it all just kind of happens. So it's conscious, and it's all the result of agency. Maybe molecules hold together because subatomic particles sort of want to be, connected in a particular way, but there's no good or bad. So you don't have a problem of explaining if a bad God, why this, if a good God, why, because it's neither of those things. It's just amoral.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the philosopher Tim Mulgan has a book, Purpose in the Universe, where he argues for what he calls ananthropic purposivism, which is that there is a God, there is a purpose to the universe, but it's nothing to do with us.
Right.
Sort of accidental byproducts.
Yeah.
And this is what I love, I love, you just get stuck in the dichotomy. I love exploring these possibilities.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so why don't I go for that or the view you described?
Yeah.
I think, look, why do we think the fine-tuning needs explaining? Why do we think there's something striking here? I think it's because of all the values the constants could have had, they fall in the narrow range that are compatible with things of great value. Life, intelligent life, people falling in love and writing poetry. There you go. I came up with some good things. Most of the other universes you get from different values is there's kind of just hydrogen, or it all collapses in a split second, or it shoots apart so quickly that no two particles ever met. There's little or no value in these universes. I think what strikes us is that the constants are compatible with value. Okay, so I think that needs explaining. So there's some push towards value, but then there's the suffering.
Yeah, because there's also, you kind of need the fine-tuning to get suffering. You know what I mean? Like you don't get like conscious organisms who suffer from evolution by natural selection without the fine-tuning too. So it kind of feels to me that those almost cancel each other out in a way that you're left with this amoral universe.
I don't see how they'd cancel out. I just think you need to explain both. I mean, maybe, you could have a sort of hypothesis where you've got a God that's a bit good and a bit bad. I don't know, I'm watching the Vikings on Netflix. This kind of the Viking gods are a bit, maybe they get a bit moody, but they're good in some ways. But you'd have to somehow describe the hypothesis of this God's mixed moral character such that you get the mix of good and bad we actually find, such that you get, okay, the constants are just right for life, but then you get cancer and stuff. I just don't see how it's going to be like some very complicated psychology. Whereas what's great about my hypothesis, if I may say, is very simple. God's just perfectly good, but has got these very precise limitations that you can specify in a way that's simpler than physics. So that's why at the moment I'm thinking that's the best option. But I'm open-minded.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem
that kind of makes sense to me. I think maybe one solution would be that, like, God, it's not necessarily that he's amoral, but maybe he just has a different sense of morality. So, like, his base value that drives his morals, the base behind his morality is just different to how it operates in human beings. So that could be a solution in which morality just looks so different. And in some areas, it aligns with our base value, but in other areas it doesn't. And so that's why we get both good and bad according to our moral system. But in God's sense, it's all good, but we just don't fully align. So potentially that could be the thing, because our bases don't quite align, but there's some interaction once we get away from those bases. And that's what we call the interaction where they meet is what we call good, and where they don't meet is what we call bad. So that's maybe another option.
A little bit weird that there would be any kind of like human value on the level of, pain and pleasure and stuff like that if the universe were completely amoral, because you might imagine that it's conscious, so it's got some kind of desire to limit in various ways, to have tables and chairs and clouds and planets and stuff, but to bring about like pleasure and pain seems like there's this element of desire, because pleasure and pain are necessarily tied to desire, right? Like to be in pain is to not want an experience while you're having it.
Yeah.
And to be in pleasure, to experience pleasure is to want an experience while you're experiencing it. I think those are good definitions of pleasure and pain. And so you do seem to bring in this element of desire. And if there is some kind of desire, traditionally good and bad are thought to just be sort of expressions of the desire of God. Something is good because that flows from God's nature. And if these concepts of desire and pleasure and pain just flow from the nature of the universe, maybe we can just say that that's what morality is. It's the good and bad that we feel. We feel it because we are expressions of the universe. And so, like, our sort of concepts of good and bad are expressions of the universe's conception of good and bad. Maybe. I get it gets a little bit murky. But if I were to say to you, for example, Philip, I'm totally convinced, fine-tuning, there's got to be an explanation, and I think that there's a God, and you said to me, but then you've got to explain suffering, and I just said to you, okay, God is amoral. Would you say, well, I disagree with you, I think you're wrong? Or would you say, yeah, maybe, fair enough, but I've just got this other view? Like, how committed are you to the view that in order to solve this problem, we limit God's power instead of limiting his goodness?
By studying geometry, we can...
I just have to say, that was a very well-phrased question. As someone who does these podcasts, that was very well-phrased. That's amazing. He's such a good speaker. I love that about Alex. It's so cool.
Maybe you have a more hedonistic meta-ethics than me. I suppose, look, I think you could have, as a panpsychist, I think you could have pleasure and pain maybe in a universe where there's just hydrogen. Maybe there's ecstasy in, I think Galen Strawson, my PhD supervisor, I studied with him because he was basically the only
panpsychist in the world, yeah.
So I went and studied with him. I talk about this bit of my book, Galileo's Error. He thinks, there's bliss before evolution. It's evolution brings in suffering because that kind of motivates you to survive. So the rest of the universe is blissful. Okay, but what you get with the right constants is complex organisms that can ultimately become rational and reflect on their own existence and make moral choices and have understanding. So I think there's a very great value in, poetry and philosophy and understanding reality, or trying to understand reality. There's a great value there that you wouldn't just get in a universe of blissful hydrogen. So I want an explanation of how come at the start of the universe you get the right numbers for those kind of great values. Then don't make them inevitable, but that are compatible with them in a small range that are compatible with them. So I don't see how your amoral God would explain that. I think you've got to say, well, in some way, the creator, which could be just the universe, aimed at something of value. Now, they might have aimed at something of value to destroy it, but then, okay, well, tell me more about the story. There's this psychology, and it gets complicated. So that's how I'm thinking of it.
Just thinking there, the way you said, like, this creator, but maybe the creator just is.
Clinton, you said, yeah, I think God not being all-powerful makes the most sense. I think Jesus taught so much about love that God being all-powerful just doesn't fit. for me. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that that kind of makes a lot of sense. There's obviously so many ways to think about it, but I think that's a very solid way to think about it. And a lot of really smart and valuable philosophers, when constructing these different ideas and these theodicies, have just decided to go with the notion that God is limited in power in his omnipotence. And so I that's a valid way to think about it. And yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks for the thought.
Is the universe. Our language is a bit tricky here because when you say, well, the creator is just the universe, I'm kind of picturing the universe as this big orb that is then creating stuff like within itself, and it kind of gets a bit difficult to conceptualize. How interested are you in like non-Western philosophical traditions? The reason I ask is because, like, if you were to ask someone from the Vedic tradition, if you were to ask a Hindu, they would probably say that, you know, the closest approximation to God is Brahman, which is sort of the unknowable knower, the unmoved mover, it always has to be described in these quite mystical terms. And they say it's not quite like this being who creates the world. It's rather kind of just everything that is Brahman. And it seems to be like, maybe because it's always a little bit vague, because it has to be, it seems a little bit easier to get across this idea that you're not talking about some creative dude who comes along and goes, zap, there's a universe. But you're also not talking about this super naturalistic view where a universe just starts going zap, zap, zap and bringing things into existence. There's just this sort of one creative force that we're all a part of. I wonder, are you like attracted to that? Because it seems to me from what you're saying, if we hadn't used the word Christianity yet or whatever, and you said, you know, these are some of the thoughts I'm having, I would say, you know, Philip, you're starting to sound a bit like a Hindu, sooner than I would say, you know, heretical Christianity.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I was an atheist for 30 years. But in that time, I was sort of spiritual but not religious kind of person. I've always been taken mystical experiences very seriously. And I think being a panpsychist, you're better able to do that. Maybe we could talk about that. And I guess I always thought, like many spiritual but not religious people, you know, Buddhism is deep, Advaita Vedanta has spiritual depths, but, you know, Christianity is all about, you know, doing what the old guy in the sky wants so you get to heaven. And part of what has brought me back to Christianity, though, is discovering the mystical traditions of Christianity that have always been there since the start. And particularly the Eastern Church and how they think about the core of Christianity. So I think, you know, when I...
the Gnostic texts that think of salvation less as this idea of being saved through a belief in the resurrection, in a system of I believe that this is true, I have faith that this is true. The Gnostic belief system would have been a little bit more about knowing the wisdom and the knowledge, the gnosis that Jesus taught. So it's more concerned with the teachings of Jesus and what he taught and applying that to your life and understanding that than it is about this idea of, do I have the right beliefs about the resurrection of Jesus and whether he died for my sins? So that's a very kind of Pauline perspective, but there's a lot of scholars that propose that, you know, Gnostic Christians, Gnostic thought in the Gnostic texts, which they don't date to the same time as the Gospels, the Synoptic and the Gospel of John, but they date close to it, specifically the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas, I believe, is like 135. And so they're close, and we believe that there's a oral tradition prior to all of that. So the notion is that the Gnostic texts very well could be the true Christianity that is just hidden. And yes, the texts date later, but there's definitely oral tradition, just like there is oral tradition behind the Synoptic Gospels as well. Not to mention the fact that Thomas agrees, like 75% of the Gospel of Thomas is just restatements of the Synoptic Gospels. So it's not like these totally disagree. But yeah. Anyway, I like that thought. I think it's very unique, and the idea that Christianity is this idea of gnosis, this idea of shedding off the material, the physical world, and accepting that which is within the spiritual world is very beautiful. And I think it's a very interesting idea, and it in some senses can agree with panpsychism as a concept. So yeah, no, I like that. I like that.
Was growing up, this is what I thought was the core of Christianity. We're all sinners. We deserve to burn in hell forever. Fortunately, Jesus is up for taking the rap for us, so we're going to, if we accept that kind gift, we'll go to heaven, right? Mm-hmm. And this sort of makes no intellectual sense to me in sorts of ways. Like, why does it fulfill justice to punish an innocent person? And also, it doesn't make sense to me on a spiritual level. My sensus divinitatis just kind of says, nah. Mm-hmm. But then, what I've discovered embarrassingly fairly recently is, that version of Christianity, which we call penal substitution, was invented basically by the Protestant reformers 500 years ago. It has not been a form of Christianity back to the start. This is one of the things I say on X that seems to most...
Okay, so he's not referring to the Gnostic text then. Maybe he was referring to it earlier. He's referring to Orthodox Christianity and the rejection of penal substitutionary atonement. The idea that, God took on our sins on the cross when he died. Instead, they would see it more as this notion of a sickness that is being healed rather than a payment of sin that must be justified on the cross. It's a sickness that must be healed through the process of taking on the pain and the suffering of the cross. So it's a different thought, Eastern kind of orthodoxy thought. So it'll be interesting to hear how that has impacted him. But it makes sense. Penal substitutionary atonement in even Orthodox Christianity in general is not fully accepted by everyone. So yeah, we'll see what he says.
Most annoy people.
I've seen a
because
bit of...
I think a lot of Americans think that is Christianity and you're a heretic if you don't. No, this was, invented by Calvin and Luther, basically.
So what's the idea before that in terms of Jesus' sacrifice, if not a
there
penal
has never
substitution?
been, so there was big decisions and councils about the Trinity and, the divinity of Christ and so on, but there was never any official decision on how to understand how Jesus brought salvation, the mechanism there. And in fact, and what I've become fascinated with is how the Eastern Church thinks about this, right? So it has absolutely nothing to do with sin and punishment. It's all to do with God and humanity and the entire universe becoming one, right? So God's not interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. God's fundamental desire is to become one with the entire universe. And so this is what they think the Jesus stuff was all about. It was all about, it was a crucial part of this ongoing process of God and the universe becoming one. God became more like us so that we can become more like God. So when I, learned about this fairly recently, it's a form of Christianity that deeply resonates me on a spiritual level. Mm-hmm. I think it fits with panpsychism. I think it makes sense of mystical experiences that I take very seriously. And while at the same time this was happening, I think, so as I said, I think there's head and heart things going on here. So at the same time, I become convinced intellectually by the fine tuning that there's a purpose to this.
So this reminds me, I got the Gospel of Thomas pulled up here. It's one of my favorite verses in the Gospel of Thomas. It is saying number 22. Jesus says the following: Jesus saw infants being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then ask as children enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, when you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female, and when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in the place of a hand, and a foot in the place of a foot, and a likeness in the place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom. So there's this notion of becoming one here that, Goff was kind of getting at. And then, but there's this notion of becoming like an infant, that these infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom. And that can be kind of confusing, but the notion that makes the most sense is, what does it mean to become one? It means to shed off the identities of this world, right? So what does he mention? He mentions the identity of being male and female. He also mentions the identity here of like your eye, like designating that as an eye, your hand designating that as a hand. It's these identity factors, these things that are like, this is what this is what that is, categorizing this and that. That's what separates us. When we categorize things, when we say that, this right here is a coffee cup and not just what is, right? That's how we separate one another. We separate each other through race. We separate each other through gender. We separate each other through a lot of different things. But an infant has no knowledge of these identities. An infant just is. It just exists. And the interesting thing is, these are not children. The Synoptic Gospels talks about children, but Jesus here talks about infants. And there's a key difference between a child and an infant. A child, yes, is learning some of these identities, but the key difference between a child and an infant in a Jewish context is the fact that a child has been circumcised for a male or not circumcised for a female, designating the most primal identity that one must shed off, which is gender. A child prior to the 8th day has not been circumcised and thus has not been given the identity of a male or a female. And so it is able to exist as one with the universe. It is able to exist as is and does not have to worry about the identities that this world brings, that brings suffering because of the ego, that brings suffering because of the separation and the loneliness. This is a lot of what Gnostic thought is. So this is kind of what he's referring to here. And this is one of my favorite sayings in the sayings of the Gospel of Thomas, because it's this idea of shedding off identity and becoming one, becoming like an infant who's never even explored or been given said identities that are fake. Let the inside become like the outside and the outside like the inside. The soul and the body, let them become one. Let us all become one. So, love this a lot. Really, really good stuff here. Super cool.
The universe, and then I learn about this, how the Eastern Orthodox Church think about the core of Christianity, and then I think, this seems to me like a plausible view of what the purpose of the universe might be.
Okay.
And so the head and heart kind of came together at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting account, and I appreciate you sort of telling me how it happened in fact. But I'm kind of interested in a few questions here. One of which is like this figure of Jesus, because the thing that really distinguishes Christianity is the Jesus character, right?
Yeah.
This particular human being who is also God, who, does something through his crucifixion and resurrection that brings us into unity with God. Traditionally, in terms of forgiveness from sin, because we can't be unified to God if we're in a state of sin, and so he does that for us. But even if not, there's still a sense in which he dies for us. Like, while we're still sinners, Christ died for us. And if the job of Jesus was just to become more like us so we can become more like God, it seems like an unnecessary extravagance that he gets crucified by the Romans, right? He could have just come to earth, lived a life, ascended into heaven. Bob's your uncle, as they say.
Dry turkey never
While we wait, I saw a comment here. I grew up learning eternal conscious torment. I'm more convinced in annihilationism now, although it's hard for me to square that with my view of Jesus. My heart says universalism is right. Yeah, I mean, there are fairly good arguments. I also grew up with eternal conscious torment. And then after reading, Revelation and the idea of the second death, I became a little bit more convinced of annihilationism as well, which is easier to swallow than eternal conscious torment. But universalism as a concept, I think you have to read the Bible a lot more poetically and kind of read through the lines. And I would agree, it's a little bit more difficult to accept. But there are ways of reading the Bible, especially when it talks about from one eternity to the next. What does that mean? Well, from eternity to eternity might be referring to not an eternal thing, but instead from one age to the next age, things will occur. And we see that happening throughout the texts, and that could be an indication of a universalist interpretation rather than a eternal interpretation of the text. I do think if you're just reading the Bible, honestly, I think it lends itself to either eternal conscious torment or annihilationism, but there is room for universalism, and I agree with you. I think as someone with a heart and who reads the words of Jesus, I think that seems like the best explanation. Of course, the sin that will never be forgiven, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, does seem to be a challenge to that as well. But Christian mystics do claim God by direct experience. Simeon, the new theologian, emphasized theoria, direct vision of God. Macer spoke of his insight to what he called the Godhead. The Gnostic claimed this direct experiential wisdom of God, non-duality, or what William James called mystical experience, which is also a term recognized within the neuroscience of religion. Non-duality, or what William James called mystical experience, which is also a term recognized with neuroscience. Yeah. To what he called the Godhead. Yes. So, sorry, I had to read that a couple times to get what you were referring to. So, yeah, the notion within Gnostic thought is it's very experiential. You have to experience the knowledge. And in a sense, when you read a text like the Gospel of Thomas, I mean, it opens up this way. You have to read it yourself. You have to experience it yourself. There's a sense in which you can't just like read the Gospel of Thomas and eat a cheeseburger at the same time, because then you aren't experiencing the text. You aren't meditating on the text. Instead, you have distraction. You have physical distraction going on. Instead, you have to be in sync with the text and be able to read it in that experiential sense. That's why gnosis is more than just necessarily knowledge. It's like experiential knowledge is really a better definition of what gnosis really is. Oh.
Up to me about Christian, Bob's your uncle, as they say. The other question that springs out to me about Christianity, on your view, is that if the universe is just God, for want of a better word, then, like, as far as we are all manifestations of consciousness that are within the universe, we're all expressions of God. We all have the divine within us. We've all sort of come from the same place. in what special sense can Jesus be God in a way that you and I are not on this view? Because for the traditional Christian, it's like, well, there's a kind of dualism. There's this world, and then there's heaven, and there's God. And Jesus is God, or Jesus is special because that external realm has sort of entered into our world. You know, the word becomes flesh and dwells among us. Whereas on your view, everything does that. Everything springs out of this divinity of the universe. So what's so special about Jesus?
Yeah, so I think you asked me earlier, is my view a form of pantheism or panentheism? So pantheism being the view that God just is the universe, they're just one and the same thing. Whereas panentheism being the universe is within God. So God is more expansive than the universe, but the universe is sort of embedded within God.
Or like a part of God.
Yeah. And I think if I was just going off the fine-tuning and the panpsychism, I'd be a pantheist. Insofar as I've embraced Christianity, and I think that's a matter of faith rather than certainty, I suppose I'd be more inclined to a panentheist view. So there's more to God than the universe. The universe is within God, as St. Paul said, in God we live and move and have our being, but there's more to God than the universe. So I suppose the core of the Eastern view, which they call deification, right? The idea is that they say we will become gods. So the way the Eastern Church thinks about it, right? The idea is for these two things to become tightly unified. This is what they see in Jesus' beautiful metaphor about the vine and the branches. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches." Think of that intimate organic connection between a vine and its branches. But the thought is there's a problem, that we're really different to God, or we're really different to that bit of God that's outside of the universe. Philosopher Robin Collins has a nice analogy, is that it would be like trying to graft a branch onto a horse, trying to bring us together with God, trying to unify God and us would be like trying to graft a branch onto a horse. They sort of just don't fit together. So to solve that problem, to close the gap, God had to share in our form of existence. In life, in suffering, in death, fully share in human existence in order to allow us to ultimately fully share in God's form of existence. And that's what the Eastern Church, they're happy to say, we will become gods.
Yeah.
We won't become identical with God, but we will fully share in God's form of existence. What it's like to be God will ultimately be what it's like to be us. It almost sounds heretical in itself, but that is just, I think to American Protestant Christians, that's heresy. But that is the standard view in the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Okay, so panentheism as opposed to pantheism means there's something outside of the universe, which is God. And so does that mean that the thing that's special about Jesus is that whilst you and I are expressions of the universe, Jesus is somehow an expression of like the whole thing? Because Jesus is also just an expression of the universe. But is it like there's something about this outside the universe God sort of thing that enters into I'm still a little bit confused about what it is that's special about Jesus. And also, it starts to sound a bit similar to just traditional Christianity. Like, yeah, the universe is kind of, if you want to call it a part of God, fine. But the main thing is that that God is bigger than the universe. God is outside of the universe, and that the universe kind of exists through him, and Jesus enters into that. It starts to sound almost a bit orthodox.
Your connections to the past are waiting. Get Ancestry DNA for only $29.
Join ICE with bonuses up to $50,000.
Let me just respond to some of this stuff. So there's a couple comments. I'm basically referring to Gnosticism or mysticism, Christian mysticism to be specific. Clinton says, I'm very uneducated, but what he's saying kind of sounds like Mormonism a little bit. So it's different than Mormonism because I'm assuming what you're referring to in Mormonism is the idea that once you reach the celestial realm in the highest order of the celestial realm, you then are gifted a planet, and with your wife, you can repopulate that planet and basically be what God is to us on planet Earth to that planet. I'm assuming that's kind of what you're referring to. There's a key difference, though. Mormonism believes that God has a body. God is physical. And so just as you are physical, God is physical. And in that, there is a physical creation of humankind, in that it's not like speaking into existence, but it is actual physical intimacy that creates mankind. And so God has a wife and a physical body and all of that. Gnosticism's very opposite of that. Gnosticism is entirely valuing spirituality. That which is spiritual is higher than that which is physical. And so that would be a major key difference. Another thing is this idea of oneness is not that through good works we become more like God and then get the potential ability of entering the celestial realm and basically being like God and creating a new world. It's actually different than that. It's becoming one with God. So instead of becoming an equal on par to God, it's becoming one with God, in which there is no separation because everything is spirit. So in the Gospel of Thomas, an interesting verse that kind of hits at this notion is in verse 13. This is a very popular verse. It says, Jesus said to his disciples, compare me to someone and tell me who I am like. So this is very similar to the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus is like, who do you say that I am? And Peter in the Synoptic Gospels gives the right answer. He says that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus is like, you did not understand this, but this has been revealed to you. Peter is now the bad guy in the Gospel of Thomas, and we'll see that. Compare me to someone and tell me who I'm like. Simon Peter said, you are like a righteous angel. Matthew said to him, you are like a wise philosopher. Thomas said to him, Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like. Jesus said, I am not your master. Because you have drunk and you have become intoxicated from the babbling spring which I have measured out. And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they said to him, what did Jesus say to you? Thomas said to them, if I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up. So in this, we kind of see that instead of Peter being kind of the good guy that knows everything, that knows the inside scoop of Jesus, we see that Peter here and Matthew are kind of the bad guys. And in some sense, Thomas is actually the bad guy too, because Jesus refutes Thomas when he says, Master, I am not your master, is what he says, which is interesting. Now, Jesus is of higher authority, but in the Gospel of Thomas, obviously it depends on your interpretation, but I think a really good way of understanding this is that Jesus is the example. He is the forefront. He is the firstborn of all creation, which is similar to what Paul has to say. He is the forefront of what it means to be one with God, to drink from the spring. And so in a sense, as much as Jesus is drinking from the spring of the Father, the disciples are drinking from the spring that Jesus has allotted to them. And so he's not the master, but he is the example. And once you tap into the spring, which is God, you then can become one with God as well. So that's kind of the notion of Gnosticism here. It's not the idea that like God is body and that through living the carnal like goods of this world, we can then become like God and then inherit a very similar situation to what God has. No, it's this idea of becoming one with God. And just as Jesus is our example of tapping into the oneness of God, we can then tap into Jesus and allow others to tap into Jesus. And in that process of following his example, tap into the Father and everything become one. So that's at least the notion of, I say all that because I want to mention this. the Gospel of Thomas is one version of Gnosticism. There are several different versions of Gnosticism. And so this is not the only type of Gnosticism. There are a lot of things that distinguish from one expression to another. I think this is more kind of a Sethian understanding of Gnosticism. But the main notion is that Gnostics value that which is spiritual over that which is physical. Beyond that, there isn't really a lot of agreement. But what we're seeing here from what Goff is talking about is this notion of oneness, and that does get expressed in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, and it's expressed in other Gnostic texts as well. You can read it all at the Nag Hammadi. If you want to learn more about this, give me a second. Highly recommend. If you want to read the Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi scriptures. Nag Hammadi is a place where they found a lot of Gnostic scriptures. It's in Egypt, and it's close to Alexandria. They found the Nag Hammadi text, the Nag Hammadi library, and this has all of the Gnostic texts. So the Gospel of Thomas is just a short one. It's a tiny one. There's the Gospel of the Egyptians. There's the Gospel of Judas, right? There's the, what was the one I was just talking about? Gospel of Bartholomew. And so you can kind of look through all of these. I haven't read the entire thing yet, but I hope to. And highly recommend checking this out. There's a lot of different translation versions of it too. The one that I have is, what was it? Introduction by Elaine Pagels. I forgot what it was. I took a class on this and I am blanking right now. Yeah, the Marvin Meyer edition. So he's the one that edited it. Highly recommend getting this version and everything. But you can read a lot of the texts online, like I was showing you. This one here is the Marquette one, University of Marquette. This one's translated by Thomas O. Lambden, I believe. So I use this in my class a lot of the time, but highly recommend getting the physical copy too, just because it's nice to not have that distraction of while you read it, be able to kind of just read it as it is while you are doing it. So highly recommend that version. Okay, I think I see. Thanks, guys. Were those the ones basically found in buried jugs? So you're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those ones were found by Bedouin shepherds at the Dead Sea. So this is a different library of texts. Those ones are older. So these texts date anywhere from like 2nd century to like, I want to say, I better not say. I want to say, don't quote me on this, but like 2nd century to like 4th century is when the Nag Hammadi library would have been kind of written. Definitely fact check me on that. I might be wrong. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, that dates to before Jesus. So that's where we get a lot of the Hebrew Old Testament, and a lot of apologists point to the Dead Sea Scrolls as evidence of consistency with the Old Testament, because we have texts prior to Jesus that agree with his interpretation and translation and quotation of the Old Testament. So that's pretty cool. You also get Wes Huff talking about how Isaiah is word for word identical with the Masoretic text, which is 1,000 years apart, which is not true, but it is very similar. So it's very cool. But yeah, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls for you. Anyway, we will continue on with the video. Oh, I have on mute. Yeah, this stuff is so interesting. I love this so much. It's so cool.
Yeah, so the Eastern Church distinguishes between two aspects of God. the essence of God and what they call God's energies. So the essence is the fundamental identity of God, which they take to be completely unknowable, completely transcendent, completely beyond human understanding. Whereas God's energies are God's form of existence, God's manifestation, God as a living force that is immanent and that we ultimately participate in. So I suppose that the specialness of Jesus, I suppose, would be Jesus understood as part of God's essence that we will never be. So it's different to Advaita Vedanta, because on Advaita Vedanta, we are Brahman because there's nothing more than Brahman.
Yeah, tell us what that means.
Advaita Vedanta is a form of Hindu mysticism. Literally means non-dual.
Yeah.
The non-dual form of Vedanta, where all there is Brahman, ultimate reality, ultimate divine reality, if you like. And the word Atman, which is the word for the fundamental self or soul. And the core of Advaita Vedanta is that Atman is Brahman. What I refer to with the I pronoun, my deepest self is Brahman. And that there's nothing more than Brahman. So the Eastern Church doesn't go that far. In terms of God's essence, that will always be distinct from us. But in terms of God's form of existence, God's manifestation, what it's like to be God, we will fully share in that. I like to sort of speculate whether mystics in these two traditions were having the same experiences, but interpreting them in different ways, having this sense of oneness with the divine. So in the Eastern Church as well, there is a deep oneness with the divine. It's not quite as radical as Advaita Vedanta, but there's still that oneness, whether they're just interpreting the same experiences in different ways. But you said, this is sounding orthodox. In terms of my core spiritual understanding of Christianity, it is just the non-heretical view of the Eastern Orthodox Church. I call myself a heretic, I suppose, to flag up that non-standard in certain respects. I've got a non-standard view of the resurrection. For example, I don't think the resurrection experiences were a matter of seeing and touching a body. I think they were a matter of visionary experiences. I'm very influenced by Dale Allison.
Which is not to say false. It's not to say that they're not like real or true.
No, I think there was a radical transformation in reality. God and the universe coming closer together, the possibility of deification. And I think what happened on Easter Sunday morning is people, starting with Mary Magdalene and then Peter, were getting thrown to the ground, experiencing deification for the first time in human history. And that was the radical experience that kicked off Christianity. So I think there was something real going on here. It wasn't just feeling good about things, but I don't think it was seeing and touching a body.
Can I ask why you don't go that far? You said just before that the Eastern Orthodox Church, which you're not a member of, by the way, you've spoken about the Eastern tradition, which you're attracted to, but you like people might get the impression, you are an Eastern Orthodox Christian now, but that's not what you're saying.
No, so whilst I accept the core understanding of Christianity from the Eastern Church, I think there's other things I disagree with. They think God's all powerful. They believe in bodily resurrection. And also, they don't have women priests. They think gay sex is sinful. And I think these are manifestly false and harmful, right? So actually, where I found my spiritual home is in the combination of the mysticism of the Eastern Church and the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church. So I'm a practicing Anglican. I mean, if you just had the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church, you say it's a bit wet, it's a bit empty, it's mostly based around drinking tea, as the comedian Dylan Moran said. But it's the combination of the two, sort of the spiritual depths of the Eastern Church, which is the core of my spiritual life, but also the flexibility of the Anglican Church, that you have women priests, that you have a more more flexibility in how you
now a woman
anything.
Archbishop of Canterbury, indeed.
Yeah.
But so you're
That's
not
cool.
Eastern
I didn't know
Orthodox, but you said a moment ago like that they don't go as far as to call everything, Brahman, as to say that I, in my deepest self, am the same thing as Brahman. Why don't you go that far? I mean, it seems like quite an attractive view. I just wonder if there's something in this Vedic, Brahmanic philosophy that makes you go, I'm not so on board with that, and I'm more on Team Jesus. Because, like I said earlier, without hearing much more detail than what you've said today, I would say that you sound sort of quite compatible with a Vedic view of the world, and it feels a bit trickier to explain the uniqueness of Jesus and certainly the crucifixion and resurrection stuff, like so this added material. It just seems like we are all just manifestations of Brahman, and it's all sort of one big thing called the universe, and that's what consciousness is. And consciousness, the self, is the same thing as the universe. Brahman, Atman is Brahman. It just seems to sort of go together quite well. You know what I mean? And I wonder if there's something that puts you off that.
I suppose I do struggle with where the bad stuff comes from for Advaita Vedanta, which is the problem in all the religions. If there's just Brahman, why is there suffering? Now, of course, Christianity has this problem as well.
Yeah,
I've got a slightly heretical answer to that God is limited, but God is trying to create something new and something good, which is creation, which is partly separate from God, and then ultimately a unity between God and creation.
And that's what Jesus does.
And that's what that's the core movement in this. So my interpretation of Christianity, God's on the way to making a perfect universe, but unfortunately can only do that in 2 stages. God can't just create it like that. God can only do it in 2 stages. Firstly, creating a kind of okay universe with the right numbers to create life, for life to evolve. And then when it's evolved enough, starting to unify with it. So it's going to be really good in the end.
I think it doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it? Like in Genesis, and he looked upon what he had made and he saw that it was okay. Yeah, it's all right. It'll do for now.
It's going to be really good in the end, though. But and God's like, oh, I'm sorry, it's going to be messy, evolution and cancer and all that, but is this or nothing? Whereas, I had a recent discussion with
I can definitely get along with that. I do see morality as something that progresses, and so that seems to follow the type of tradition that he's suggesting here, which is that, God is limited in his power and reveals his desire over time, and humans can be maybe part of that process of revealing that which is beautiful and good over time in doing that. So yeah, I like that. Coffee said, I haven't heard him mention something like the perennial philosophy, which regards mysticism as the common core of the world's major religions. Yeah, there hasn't really been much of a mention of perennial philosophy. He kind of got into that maybe a little bit. Potentially he sees Jesus as the perfect representation of mysticism, and so in a sense Jesus is the core, as he was saying, of perennial philosophy. But I don't know. So I would be curious as to what he would refer to that as being the case. Is Jesus that kind of a representation of that? I don't know.
With a Advaita Vedanta mystic and expert, and where does the bad stuff come from? And then they could say to me, well, it's an illusion. There isn't really bad stuff. And then I'm like, okay, this is mysticism too far. That there is bad stuff, and I want to know where it comes from. So in my slightly heretical version of Eastern Orthodox, we've got an answer.
Yeah,
we're building something good, a unity between God and creation, and it's just messy along the way. But God's limited, and so that's the only way he can do it. So
That's not unheard of in the Christian tradition too. You know, this idea of like bad is just a privation of good. It doesn't really exist. Those ideas, and what you said earlier resonates with me, that a lot of the time I don't want to do the sort of hippy dippy, everyone saying the same thing, man. There are clearly doctrinal distinctions between religious groups. But when it comes to the mystical tradition, when it comes to the experiential stuff, there does seem to be a lot of getting at the same thing.
Yes, this is exactly what you were just saying. I love it. I love it.
In different words. Yes. I mean, I could read a passage from John 17. I talk about this a lot, and it would sound like I'm reading a piece of Hindu scripture. It'd sound like I'm reading, you know, I don't know what text I'd be reading, something from the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita or something, where Jesus is saying, like, you know, praying for his disciples and saying, just as we are one, Father, may they be one with each other and one with me, and me and you and them and me, so that we all may be created, brought into perfect unity, we may all ultimately be one together. Now, Christians, of course, slot that into their theology, which, you know, they can do, but on the surface, at least, it's like, that sounds a little bit weird. When Jesus has said, I and the Father are one, and in explaining what he means I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. And then goes on to say, well, I want all of the disciples and then all Christian believers to be in me just as I'm in you. You get this, again, this deification, this idea that however Jesus was one with the Father, he's kind of like the prototype for all of humankind. Now, for me, this is really interesting. I'm like, cool, so there's this guy called Jesus and he was some kind of divine figure and awesome. And I'm totally on board. I'm like, that makes perfect sense. But then he gets crucified. And then you get these sort of post-resurrection appearances and stuff. And it just seems to me that if that's all Jesus was trying to do, and there was no punishment for sin, and it was just a case of coming down to provide the way for deification, where does like the crucifixion slot into this?
Yeah, so there were two things there. Well, yeah, maybe this would be a good moment to slip in that I've just finished a new book called Heresy. It's probably been about a year before it comes out. But part of that is diving into the mystical traditions we get in all the faiths. And I'm talking more about the Abrahamic faiths because I think people think, oh, they're not very spiritual. You know, is Buddhism spiritual? But yeah, you've got Kabbalah in Judaism, you've got Sufism in Islam, and you've got the mystical traditions in Christianity. I'm looking at Ibn Arabi, the Sufi mystic who thought that, you know, God is completely beyond understanding. Even Allah is not God. That sounds heretical for a Muslim, but when you think of ultimate reality as Allah, you're qualifying it, you're relating to it, whereas ultimate reality is beyond qualification. What you were pointing to.
Okay, this is a really cool thought here. Jesus said, I and the Father are one, but I think Meister Eckhart articulated this mystical insight slightly better. Eckhart said, the knower and the known are one. Simply people imagine that they should see God as if he stood there and they here. This is not so. God and I were one in knowledge. That's cool. I really like that. So it's this idea of like people imagine that they should see God, and if he stood there and they here. This is not so. God and I were one in knowledge. So the knower and the known are one. One in knowledge. So to be, I guess, one in essence is, in that view, to be one in knowledge. So to sort of resonate with God is to be one with God in camaraderie, which I guess also kind of makes sense, because if you are valuing the mystical, the spiritual side of things more than the physical, then it doesn't matter the location. What matters is the collective understanding, the recognition of one another. That seems to matter more. Is that kind of what Eckhart's getting at there? I'm unfamiliar with that quote, so that seems pretty cool. It represents the temporary merging of consciousness and God found in mysticism, what they call the union with the divine, or absorption into the absolute. Wow, that's cool. Huh. Thank you for sharing this stuff. That's so fascinating. Huh. That's so cool. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's really cool.
There, I think, was the Last Supper narrative in John's Gospel, where it's very, Jesus gives this kind of after dinner speech, as it were, and the disciples are saying, "Oh my God, you're finally telling us how it is. You're finally giving it us straight." Now, what does he say? He doesn't say, "Right, you've all been bad people. Someone has to pay the price. Someone's going to be punished. I'm going to take the rap." No, he talks about oneness repeatedly. It's like, as you say, I'm the Father in one, and you are in me, and I am in you. It's like this intimate connection where both things are inside each other, paradoxically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this deep unity between Jesus and the being he called Father being taken out to the rest of humanity and creation. So I see deification. I think that's what he's talking about. I think he's saying this is what it's all about. Okay, but you're pushing me. I'm being a politician, dodging the question here on the crucifixion. So why was this horrific, painful death? I would say it's partly about deification, sharing fully in our miserable existence, the more gruesome aspects. I like to think also it's partly cosmic solidarity or part of the revelation of God that we're supposed to get through Jesus. St. Paul says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Why is Jesus in Luke's gospel born in poverty, put where the animals eat, greeted by shepherds rather than kings? I think this is expressing that God identifies with the poor, the weak, the excluded. So what a wonderful sign of that than seeing God as this naked, executed, humiliated peasant suffering the cruelest form of punishment that was reserved for the lowest of the low. I think it's a sign that God is on the side of immigrants in cages, is on the side of the weak and the powerless, and something which some Christians have forgotten. But yeah, so that's how I think of it anyway.
So it's kind of like a display of
this is what
solidarity.
I'm all about.
This is who I am, and this is what I'm for. I mean, I guess
that's so fascinating. So currently I'm reading God's Propaganda, which is a book that recently came out by Dr. Kip Davis. And he kind of uncovered it, basically this has nothing to do with mysticism, but it has to do kind of with his last point there, which is this notion of taking care of the weak and the lowly being a central part of Christianity. And I'd argue that that's actually a core piece of Judaism, and prior to that, ancient Israelite religion. And as I was reading God's Propaganda, the interesting thing is our oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible all seem to be suggesting this notion of like hospitality and inviting the sojourner and taking care of the sojourner. And in the book, Dr. Davis highlights this idea of like, back then, taking care of the sojourner wasn't just about like being kind to some weary traveler. It was a matter of life and death, because Israel would have been kind of these small town peoples that would have lived in sort of this wilderness, these highlands is how he describes it. And so anyone who's traveling within ancient Israel is traveling in the wilderness where there's no roads, there's no like safe places. And so if there is a sojourner in ancient Israel, it was a matter of life and death to invite them in and take care of them, feed them, give them a place to stay. Because it wasn't like a city, it was like a small town where there wasn't anything really around. A lot of small conglomerates, villages. At least that's what the ancient what's the word? Ancient like physical strata. I can't think of the right word. Archaeology. My gosh, the ancient archaeology seems to suggest. And so with that idea of taking care of the weak, I think it's so cool that as being something so core to ancient Israelite religion is something that passed on to Judaism, Second Temple period religion, all the way into Christianity, early Christianity, even Christian mysticism, and then to its modern day today. People still talk about that in church, like taking care of the weak. It's so cool how something so simple as like, we're small town folk, we value having small town values and taking care of the weary traveler has now become an emphasis as something something valuable and recognizable in modern Christianity. Like, wow, that is so crazy how, some things get dropped off along the way, like kosher laws and things of that sort. But like something like taking care of the sojourner is still a piece of Christianity in some senses, not in all, but it's still something we talk about. I think that's so cool. It's so fascinating to see, like, as faiths sort of emerge and change over time, what stays, what doesn't stay is a very interesting question. It's a very interesting thing to explore.
It's probably the ultimate way of doing that. And Christians speak in those terms, even if you took away their reflections on the nature of Jesus' sacrifice, they still say, but the reason why it was crucifixion. Because if Jesus just has to die for your sins, he could have just sort of been euthanized in his sleep. They say, no, the reason that he did it with crucifixion is to demonstrate that this sort of this concern with the poor and the downtrodden, identification with the weakest of society. And in the same way that you can separate out those questions, you can probably also then separate out those concepts. And you can say, even if you don't need the punishment for sin stuff for Jesus to be special, you still have this very good reason for him to ultimately demonstrate his identification. He's already shown us that he's identified with the highest of the high, because he's got God inside of him. So if he can show us that he's also identified with the lowest of the low, but that sort of raised a question for a lot of people as to, like, for example, why wasn't Jesus a woman? Like, women are more downtrodden in society than men are. So if Jesus had been a woman and crucified as a woman,
that's a good point.
But then I've heard people respond to that by saying that.
So there was a lot of quotes from Meister Eckhart, and thank you, Coffee. I just want to highlight that for everyone. You mentioned the Yale PDF, so I believe this is what you were referring to. So here is a list of the entire works of Meister Eckhart in mysticism, mystical works of Meister Eckhart. So check that out online. I literally just searched it up on Google, and it's like the first thing that popped up. So super cool. And then you mentioned, shout out to WikiQuote also. So either one of those resources, thank you for sharing that. Super great.
The humiliation of women is so kind of normalized in various contexts that there's almost something more humiliating about being up on the cross as a man. And depending on who says that, that's either a very feminist or a very anti-feminist perspective. Because you've got the anti-feminist who says, well, it's more humiliating for a man because, it's just worse for a man to do. And then you've got the feminist saying, like, because we're so used to seeing women like humiliated.
Yeah. And Tom Holland in his book Dominion has expressed how powerful that idea was. That God is not the king in the castle, but is this executor. But it's like, it was weird, and as we sort of gets normalized.
But I also kind of want to then ask, like, it gets to the point of parody, but if we think the universe is consciousness and, there's nothing necessarily that's super special about human beings exactly, like, why isn't Jesus a rodent or something like surely the way to really demonstrate his sort of identification with the lowest of the lowest to be like an animal who's sort of, literally fit for slaughter. Maybe there's just a communication issue there,
but
but
it has to be.
you sort of got to draw a line somewhere, I suppose.
Look, I mean, what I'm very happy to embrace is there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, sure.
So, and I mean, I can go further than that. I'm very uncertain as to whether any of this is true. I don't think faith is about certainty. I think it's about hope and trust and commitment. It's about living something out. And I think often people think about, am I going to join a religion? They have to think, is it definitely true? Oh no, there's some objection. But these things are always going to be incredibly uncertain. I think what you should think, if you're thinking of joining a religion, I think you should think, am I going to get something out of it? And is it a credible possibility? So I think evidence and arguments are, is it a credible possibility? It's always going to be very uncertain. So I suppose I've got to the point where I think this slightly heretical, Eastern Orthodox inspired Anglican version of Christianity is a credible possibility. But that leaves open that other religions, like maybe Advaita Vedanta, are also credible possibilities, leaves open a kind of pluralism that doesn't just say, oh, they're all saying the same thing, but says, if it's all about certainty, then only one can be the one where we can be certain it's true. But if we're open to like 30%, then there can be multiple religions where it's credible enough to be possible. So I feel...
Wow. That is really interesting. I love what he... I'm going to replay that real quick because I think that is life-changing right there. That's
certainty,
so cool.
Then only one say, oh, they're all saying the same thing, but says, if it's all about certainty, then only one can be the one where we can be certain it's true. But if we're open to like 30%, then there can be multiple religions where it's credible enough to be possible. So
that's so cool. So it's not this, perennial like philosophy where they all like are true based upon this mystic connection, and that's what's true. But really, it's this idea of they have some of what's true, they have some of what's true, they have some of what's true, and it's not about getting it right or having the right beliefs, but it's about living it out and receiving that 30% of the benefit from expressing this part which is authentic and true. That's really cool. I'll have to sit with that some more, but I love that thought. That's so interesting.
So I feel confident enough to commit, and that's brought me great joy. It's brought me community. It's brought me structure. It's brought me spiritual practice. That's brought many life benefits.
Gifts for the outdoors and the outdoorsy. Eddie Bauer.
It's giving.
I think it's just crazy every time an Arby's commercial shows on an Alex O'Connor video. It's funny.
Me spiritual practice that's brought many life benefits. So that's what I'm trying to do in this new book, Heresy, actually, is just aiming kind of at the spiritual but not religious. This huge ever-growing group. I'm not saying, look, here's the one true faith, you've got to believe it or you're going to hell. Just saying, look, there's things you can get out of religion, tradition, structure, community, and there's ways of engaging it that might avoid some of the worries you have. You can be very uncertain, you can be a bit heretical, you can take it all as a big metaphor if you want. There's a physics professor in my church who is a very spiritual person there every week. He says to me, what's all this mumbo jumbo you believe? I'm too orthodox. So he doesn't believe any of the specifics of Christianity. Now, of course, some churches will kick you out, but I don't know, a lot of Anglican churches or Quakers, no one's going to interrogate you. And so, yeah, that's my message, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a proponent of go to church, or if you grew up like, say, Muslim, or I guess I don't really know enough about Islam to really say this, but if there's a tradition, that's why this channel is called Truth and Tradition, because I value tradition. I think it's beautiful. I think it's good. I think it's a way of tapping into our ancestors, tapping into who came before us and learning from them. So those are good things. So I go to church. I think people should go to church, and I think it should be something where you will practice it is something in some sense, and through the art of practicing and participating in a faith, you grow as a person, and maybe it's not about being certain, but it's about the practice and growing in that process of practice and appreciating other people's practices and potentially learning from theirs as well. So that's just so beautiful. I was on the verge of crying a little bit earlier when he was talking. So that's beautiful.
And you land on saying you are a Christian? Like, would you describe that? I mean, I understand you qualify it because we're having a conversation about your beliefs, but in your day-to-day, would you just say to people sort of who ask you on the street, like, I'm a Christian? Is that like your view now?
Yeah, I suppose the only reason I qualify it is because so many identify Christianity with a very particular form, maybe sort of US evangelical Christianity. And I'm not saying evangelical Christians are horrible people. A lot of them are my very good friends. But that's not the kind of Christianity I find plausible, spiritually resonates with me. So I suppose I might qualify it just because people may get an idea that's different from the truth. But yeah, I'm a Christian, sure. It's an important part of my life, and it's made me quite happy. I don't know if it's true, but made me quite happy. So,
well, maybe that's all that matters. I mean, at least it does for the individual. Like, who cares doctrinally when it comes to experience of the divine? I mean, I talk all the time about how people who report having intense religious experiences, they just sort of give up on the intellectualizing and realize that that's kind of not what it's about. And so, it's interesting to talk about, but I would be interested in seeing this fleshed out in an intellectual fashion, which it sounds like you've kind of done in this book, which I'm excited to read. You should send me a proof copy. I'd love to have a flip through.
I'd love to.
That would be really, really cool to see. And I think people are interested in, I don't want to say your journey, because we were talking before we started recording about how people often do that. They do that to you and they do it to me as well. Like, as soon as you say anything friendly to Christianity, it's like, awesome, look, this person's on board. And then when you say, yeah, but I'm not sure God is all powerful, or yeah, but I'm not sure Jesus claimed to be God, then it's like, he's on a journey, he'll get there eventually. He'll get there eventually. And like you said before we started recording, like, maybe you're already there. Maybe this is just the place to end up,
Yeah, next time I talk to an evangelical Christian, I'm going to say, oh, you're on a journey
towards the limited power God. You'll get there eventually.
I mean, insofar as I'm embracing the core of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that's much older than the Protestant idea of penal substitution that was like 500 years ago. You often get the sense that there can't be innovation.
Yeah.
Right? But religions have always reimagined themselves. Aquinas was radically new philosophy at the time. The Protestant reformers had a radically new understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. So what's wrong with this? Maybe thinking maybe God's not all powerful in the way we previously thought, and maybe this is just part of our moral understanding. I find like the problem of evil, I think you might agree with this, Alex, becomes more pressing as we've advanced morally and understood the importance of animal suffering, for example. So maybe this is part of progress and progressing in our understanding of God. That no, God's not going to be cruel enough to create a world like this if she could help it. There's another thing that winds up conservative Christians too.
You're doing that on purpose.
Yeah, with Craig, he said, when he was talking about my book, and he said, and he uses the word she. I don't know. I mean,
I remember that.
Especially snowflakes, these traditionalists, they just...
I love it. I'm just so happy listening to this conversation. And honestly, Alex just remarked exactly what I was referring to at the beginning of this episode, which is, everyone's on their own sort of spiritual journey. And for you to say, oh, you're on a journey, you're going to meet me where I'm at, like eventually, to me, that just shows a lot of arrogance to say that. And I don't say that to judge the person who says that. Not at all. Because in my opinion, they are just receiving an ideology, and they have no, I guess, frame of reference or way of thinking outside of that. And that's fine. That's okay. That's where that person's at. But I think it's important to recognize that everyone is trying to understand this world. Everyone's trying to work and function in a way that works for them. And to presume your worldview is the ultimate truth and everyone else is on a journey toward your worldview or toward something that's not good, I think that's when there's a sense of arrogance there. Not arrogance necessarily on the part of the individual, but arrogance inbuilt in the ideology and potentially the individual. But I don't like to assume those things because I was there. I can empathize with that. I'm wholeheartedly, like, I was a Christian and I loved Jesus so much, and it was so deeply embedded in everything. And then there's a sense in which I still love Jesus in like a union kind of theory, kind of way of thinking. But like at the end of the day, I think what's important is to recognize that people are smart. They have good reasons to believe what they believe, and we should respect where they've ended up and respect where they will end up in the future. And it's, to me, it's just sad when we restrict it to doctrinal things and saying this must be the case. This is the only interpretation of this. I think it really limits the ability for faith to affect you and your experience, because faith is an experience. Life with God is an experience, and it can align with doctrine, but sometimes it doesn't align with the doctrine. And that's when you have to realize that the doctrine is secondary to gnosis, to the experienced knowledge. And that's, I think, exactly what, Philip Goff is getting at here. Gnosis is experiential knowledge. It's not knowledge. It's not facts. It's a practice. It's a practiced understanding. And that's exactly what I think they're getting at here. I really like that about us learning about animal suffering and maybe it just being a process. Yeah, I think morality is a process. I mean, especially if you look at something like the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of things in there that most of us are going to disagree with, but there's glimpses, like I said, with the taking care of the sojourner, there's glimpses of things we value still today, which in a sense, I mean, I don't understand the culture back then super well. There's not a lot of people that do, but that would have been something that wouldn't have been highly valued at that time, especially for people in the cities. But for Israel to kind of notice that and take that on as a value of theirs and then pass it on. And then over time, we learn more and more and more of God's character and become more aligned with the character and the representation of God. I think that is a beautiful way of understanding things. And it makes sense, like so many things that would have been seen as good back then or just normal back then are not good. And we know that they're not good, but it's because we've had this series of passed on traditions and understandings of the world where we've learned from our ancestors, we've learned from the past, we learn from each other, and we come to a better understanding of what is true. And I think that's what morality is. We don't just get a book from God that tells us everything we need to know. We have a life to learn what there is to know, to experience what is true. And so you can get that from reading a book, but you can also get that through prayer. You can get that through fasting. You can get that through meditation. You can get that through community with other people. You can get that through so many different avenues. So why restrict yourself to a doctrine and say it's good? Instead, trust your experience. And if God exists, it's an experience God gave you. So trust it as something that is. Even a woman seemed to have taught Jesus that scout even dogs getting the scraps. Oh, you're referring to the what type of woman? She was a Gentile, and she was like, even the dogs get the scraps, and Jesus was like, yeah, I affirm that. It reminds me of that scene in The Last Jedi where the temple is burning with the sacred texts, and Luke yells, "The sacred Jedi texts!" Yoda replied, "Read them, have you?" To imply that the wisdom isn't necessarily within the books. The wisdom is a potential within yourself, and the books are only a result of the wisdom. Wow. So cool. That's so well said. So poetic. Bravo. I love that. Yeah. Wow, guys, we're making progress. This is so cool. This is my favorite episode of this series so far. So cool. I love it.
Stop being so triggered, man.
Yeah.
I think, God's obviously non-binary, so they is a good pronoun, the Trinity as well.
Yeah, I think it sounds controversial to say, but it's because God is like not any of these things. It's like, God is not conceptualizable into like, categories and our categories of spatial extension and thought, and you're like, oh, so God's non-binary then. It's like, no, you liberal. But yeah, I know what you mean.
But look, I don't hate conservatives, but I think actually in most of society there can be a natural balance between progressives and conservatives. Progressives who are saying, look, we need to update in certain ways, and conservatives saying, hold on, let's be careful, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and there can be a nice balance. I think recently with religion, it's more dominated by conservatives, especially in the US. So I guess part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to try and help liberals make intellectual sense of religion, not so we can kick out the conservatives, but so we can maybe get back to that natural balance that exists in a lot of society.
Well, we will wait in anticipation until it arrives. The books that are already out are in the description if people want to buy them and read them. And whenever this new one's out, we'll try to remember to put a link there too. So if you're watching a few years in the future, it should be down there too. And if it's not, leave us a comment, send us an email, and we'll get that fixed immediately. Philip Goff, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex. A pleasure as always.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you might enjoy...
Awesome. Wow. What a conversation. That was so cool. All right. Well, like every episode, we got to leave a unique comment. So I will copy my little handy dandy phrase, and I get to knock off a video here. So 144 is where we're at. And then together, guys, we have watched 30 episodes. Nicely done. Nicely done. All right, let's get to the comment. I have so many tabs. Is that right? Here it is. So what stuck out to you guys from this conversation? Because there was so much discussed. But what were some of the main points? What were some of the main things that maybe like stuck out to you guys? Let me know in the comments below, and I will definitely include it. I really like the sentiment from The Last Jedi. The books are not the wisdom themselves. They are just simply an arbiter of the wisdom. The wisdom comes from within. It is you that has the wisdom. You said it a lot more poetically. Let's read it. To imply that wisdom isn't necessarily within the books. The wisdom is a potential within yourself, and the books are only a result of that wisdom. So good. Oh, so good. I love that. So beautiful. But yeah, that's definitely going in there. But there's so much in that, and I think the notion that we need liberals, liberal is maybe too much of a polarizing word. So maybe just like free thinkers. We need more free thinkers in the church. We need more free thinkers in religion here in the West. I think that would truly help it. a lot. We can't be so, I guess, dogmatic about things. We can't, we got to stop hating each other and despising each other. But, let's start to appreciate one another and appreciate the things that we each bring to the table. There is an appreciation of the conservative there, which I think is good. The people who love tradition. But we also need an appreciation of those who are willing to go past the tradition and explore the frontiers of faith, religion, this world. Because that's another thing. Here in the West, this is a very Western thing, and it's a modern day thing now too. We separate religion and just normal life. But in the ancient world, they were one and the same. There was no separating religion or faith from daily practices. And so I think it's a bit of an illusion that we've produced. And we say that there's this part of life that we call secular, and there's this part of life that we call religious. And you can be secular and not religious. But I really don't think that's true. I think we see that people are deeply religious, even if you don't follow a world religion. You are religious. That's exactly what people mean when they say spiritual, because spiritual things are a part of religion. Or say you really love going to concerts, and you love just like the music and participating in some of the rituals of following like a celebrity musician. That's all religious in practice. Or say you're really into like fantasy stories. Like this resonates with me. I love me some good fantasy books. And you really like to read and get immersed into a world and to think of stories in that way and to learn from stories. That whole notion is religious. It's very deep into what it means to be religious. And so in a sense, I think everything is tapping into religion, and something that we can maybe learn from the past and how they would have thought about this is to not separate the two, but to think of them as one and to re-tap into that mindset. Not to say that a specific religion should rule over the governance or the laws or anything like that. I think separation of church and state is important in the sense that we don't let one religion rule, but instead we find that which we can agree upon and let that rule. And that's going to still be religious, but it'll be a piece of religious that we can all kind of cling to and relate to. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. I will set myself up here for the comment. So just give me a sec. I will leave the comment and then I'll do my closing remarks. Yes, I love that statement. You said Matt Dillahunty, a prominent atheist, often says spirituality, as far as I'm concerned, is gobbledygook. But now with all the neuroscience on mystical experiences and even psychedelics are showing that there is something more substantive to spirituality than it being woo or nonsense. And I also think there's a sense in which we ignore, like, just because something's an illusion doesn't mean that there isn't something there. An illusion is something, right? It's a misreading of ontological reality, but it is something that exists. It is a reading of something, right? And in a sense, everything's an illusion, right? Our senses are all flawed. And so, in a very real sense, everything that we experience and feel is an illusion because we don't see reality as it ontologically absolutely is. And so, to chalk religion up to illusions and fake sites is really just stepping past the reality of things, right? It's a reading of something, and that reading still has to be accounted for. Whether or not it's ontologically accurate, it is still a reading that must be accounted for and something that can be valued and is impactful, very impactful. So yeah, that's really good. As an atheist, I think Matt Dillahunty does more harm than good. If more atheists read Oppie instead of listening to Matt Dillahunty, we would be in a better place. Yeah, I mean, I try not to speak poorly of people. I think it as always, I always like to think the best of people. Even Christian apologists that annoy the heck out of me, I still will do my best to think the best of them. And yeah, I have seen a lot of, I'm not a big follower of Matt Dillahunty, but I have seen a lot of his content, especially earlier on in his career. I haven't really followed him lately, but there is a sense of dogmatism and I guess a lack of openness to certain things. But in a sense, like he said, we do need the conservative perspective along with the liberal perspective. And so in a sense, I do respect that because, us, free thinkers, we need boxes. We need cages to keep us from going crazy, we need people to keep us grounded, so yeah, there I think there's always something to appreciate in people. And so I would definitely encourage you guys, you're not wrong with your critiques, but there's always a bigger picture, bigger story, and we can always be more charitable and kind to people in trying to understand them more accurately. Dr. K, actually, when I was looking at the Diary of the CEO interview that Alex was on with Dr. K and Greg Kokel, the thing that stuck out to me from what he said is that philosophy is about picking apart ideas and testing them and basically picking them into pieces and seeing what's still there. Whereas psychology is the very opposite of that. It's not about picking apart ideas. It's about trying to live within the ideas that are expressed by the human, to empathize and to have that experience of okay, I don't understand you, but I'm trying to understand you and what you're saying because your ideas don't fit my experience, but I can fit my experience to your ideas. And so that's kind of what psychology is about, at least when it comes to like therapy, is what Dr. K was referring to. It's not about picking apart the ideas and the expressions that the person in front of you is expressing. They might be bad ideas. They might be things that you totally disagree with, but they are expressed from true experiences, from an interaction with the world. And so we can respect that and we can try to understand where they are coming from and help them understand that where they are coming from is not necessarily the full picture and give them hope and courage in their situation. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I think materialist types are opening and awakening up to a religious views. God is no longer the sky daddy, atheists often mock. They're realizing religion has much more depth than that. Yeah, I would agree. Okay. Man, so many cool thoughts. I got to leave this comment. So continue to talk in the comments. I will figure that out real quick. I've never ended a comment with God bless you since being a Christian. And you know what? I thought it was fitting after this episode. I don't know what that exactly means to say God bless you, but I figured it fits. It just fits, you know? I said, hey, Alex, this is Jackson from the Truth and Tradition podcast. I am on a mission to watch every one of your videos and leave a comment on each of them. I loved this episode. I think this is definitely one of my favorite podcasts from you. People were responding to your quote from your podcast with Bear Grylls, saying that you were becoming a Christian, saying that this journey will inevitably lead you to Christianity, at least a non-heretical expression of it. I think it is good that you do your best to ignore these voices because they do not understand your gnosis, what you have learned from life. Continue down this road and you will continue to learn and grow. I don't think there is necessarily a finish line, but instead a journey we can all enjoy. God bless. Oh, I like that. May you reap the rewards in life that God has offer. I mean, that's how I interpret God bless you. That God has to offer. Yeah. Wow. I feel spiritually just fulfilled after this. How do you guys feel? I think I started this podcast asking people on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? And I said 8.5 because I was feeling pretty good. Honestly, right now I'm at like a 9.5. I feel very spiritually filled, after this. It's so cool. I just want to go up to Philip Goff and give him a hug. You know what I mean? So cool. So cool. Well, thank you guys. That was a longer one, so I think we're just going to do one episode reaction this week. But yeah, thank you guys so much for your comments. Thank you so much for, being part of this. This is honestly probably my favorite reacting to every Alex O'Connor video I think I've done. This was great. I think I learned a lot, and I think it was amazing. So beautiful. So really appreciate you guys. If you're new to this series, I do this every single week, every Tuesday night, 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. I react to Alex O'Connor videos in hopes of watching every single one of them and having him either on my podcast or potentially getting invited onto his podcast. So if you want to be a part of that process, come join each week and be a part of the community. So anyway, I hope that you guys do well. You got a new subscriber. I'm very interested in these topics too, and I'm trying to grow a channel myself. Thank you for the episode. Oh, really? That's awesome. Guys, go check out Coffee. Is that how you pronounce it? Coffee? I'll be checking you out and definitely subscribing to you too. Awesome stuff. But yeah, go check out Coffee. Let me show the comments here. You can he's been one of the, or she, been one of the main commenters here. So go check them out, I love that. Fellow content creator. So cool. But yeah, follow along every single week. And it's been a huge pleasure doing this with you guys. So I hope you all are well. Have a wonderful rest of your night. And God bless you guys.